Hey my friend, welcome to Sleepy Old World. Settle in. Because tonight we step out of a quiet Mayfair townhouse in the final years of the 1890s into one long night in the life of a wealthy young woman moving through fashionable London after dark. She could dine inside London restaurants so luxurious that the ordinary people passing by on the street outside could never have afforded even a single course served within them. She could notice a particular gentleman across a crowded theatre, feel something unmistakable pass between them in a single held glance, and still not be allowed to simply walk over and speak to him, not without someone else standing between them first. And a woman her age, still unmarried, could not simply be seen walking the London night alone, not without her father, her mother, or someone else at her side. And the very same gown considered perfectly proper for a grand evening out could have been considered shockingly inappropriate if she had worn it in the middle of the afternoon. If a story like this one has ever helped carry you towards sleep, a like and a subscribe helps this small channel find its way to someone else who might need it tonight too. It costs you nothing, and it means more to me than you would probably guess. I would honestly love to know where you're settling in from tonight. Leave it in the comments, I always read every single one. All right, love. Let's begin. It is early evening in London, the autumn of 1896, and Evelyn is almost ready to leave her own house behind. Not the version you are picturing. No sweeping staircase, no candlelit portrait moment. Just a small dressing room, a candle guttering against a mirror crowded with hairpins, and a maid named Sarah fastening the final hook at the back of a wine-coloured silk gown, a hook so small and so precisely placed that Evelyn could never manage it alone. Maybe she is 22. Maybe her mother has stopped worrying whether she will marry well at all and started worrying instead. Whether this will finally be the season it happens. A single strand of pearls goes around her throat. Small drop earrings catch the candlelight when she turns her head. Long white gloves, soft as paper, slide up past her elbows. A deep velvet wrap waits over the back of a chair, ready to guard bare shoulders for the 20 feet between the front door and the carriage, and nothing more than that. Sarah steps back, satisfied. Evelyn takes the stairs quickly, one gloved hand skimming the banister, past a hallway of relatives she has never met, past her father's study, where he is waiting, already dressed, checking his pocket watch with the mild impatience of a man who is never quite as prompt as he believes himself to be. A footman opens the front door. Beyond it, London is already beginning to glow, gas lamp by gas lamp, street by street. The carriage door closes behind them both, and for a moment there is only dark leather. The smell of polish and horse, and the quiet, familiar rhythm of a ride she's taken more times than she could count. Then the city arrives in pieces through the window, a shop front still glowing gold though the shop itself closed hours ago. A hansom cab rattling past in the opposite direction, its driver perched high behind the passenger seat. An omnibus crowded with men reading newspapers by lamplight. A policeman standing his patient watch at a corner. 15 minutes, and the carriage begins to slow. Light spills from tall windows onto wet pavement ahead, and a line of other carriages waits its turn at the curb. They have arrived. The change happens in about 8 seconds. Outside, cool, damp air and coal smoke. Inside, warmth rolls out to meet her. Beeswax candles, cut flowers, roasting meat, and the particular smell of money spent carefully and well. 3 enormous chandeliers throw candlelight and the newer, steadier glow of electric bulbs across a room built less for eating in than for being seen eating in. Mirrors line one entire wall, doubling the tables, doubling the woman in emerald green 3 tables over, doubling everyone currently deciding, without appearing to look at all, exactly who else has chosen to dine here tonight. Deep red carpet swallows every footstep. A waiter, deferential without being obsequious, leads them to a table dressed in heavy white linen, more silver laid at each place setting than any single course could possibly require, a low arrangement of hothouse roses forced into bloom months out of season. Her father excuses himself briefly to greet an acquaintance near the entrance, before settling across the table from her, and a waiter presents a menu printed entirely in French, as though half of London had quietly agreed to forget it also spoke English. There is turtle soup, expensive despite its plain name, sole in a pale wine sauce, a saddle of mutton carved tableside by a waiter whose knife has clearly done this exact motion 1,000 times before. Between courses, Evelyn watches the room the way everyone in the room watches the room, sapphires catching the light 2 tables over, a bottle of champagne being opened for a celebration nobody has explained yet, a young engaged couple sitting close enough together that no one needs to be told what they are. Could a woman like Evelyn simply come here alone, order her own meal, keep her own company, answer to no one? It depended enormously on who she was. A widow of independent means might dine here with barely a second glance from anyone. A young unmarried woman of 27, from a family still building her place in society, risked being read the wrong way by people who would never trouble themselves to learn the truth before repeating whatever they thought they had seen. Presence in a room like this one was valuable, and it was spent carefully. It is during the fish course that she notices him, not dramatically. She simply glances toward a table near the window and finds a young man seated with 2 companions, and something in the moment catches, the way fabric catches on a rough edge. She has seen him once before, briefly, at a ball earlier in the season, an introduction that lasted perhaps 90 seconds and evaporated the moment the crowd shifted. He does not look her way, and even if he had, she could not simply rise from her chair and cross the room to speak to him. Not because she lacked the nerve for it, but because an unmarried woman did not approach a gentleman she had not been properly introduced to, not without risking exactly the kind of notice that could travel through fashionable London faster than any letter ever could. Whatever happens next, if anything happens at all, will have to happen through someone else first. Dinner ends, the way these dinners always end, with coffee arriving in small cups too delicate to hold much liquid, with her father settling the bill through a brief quiet exchange with the waiter that Evelyn barely registers, and with the slow gathering of gloves and wraps that signals, without anyone announcing it directly, that the next part of the evening is about to begin. Outside, the temperature has dropped further, and the street looks different than it did an hour and a half earlier. Busier now, the theatre crowds beginning to move through the West End in their own currents. Carriages queuing along the curb in numbers that make the doorman's job considerably harder than it was at the start of the evening. Their own carriage is found quickly enough, the coachman having kept a careful eye on the restaurant's entrance for exactly this moment, and within minutes they are moving again, the ride this time shorter, barely long enough to settle into the seats before the carriage is slowing once more. Somewhere behind them, as the carriage draws away from the restaurant, a group of younger men spill out onto the pavement in evening dress considerably less pristine than it had been at the start of their own evening, laughing loudly enough that the sound carries faintly even over the noise of traffic, and Evelyn watches them for a moment through the rear window before the carriage turns a corner and they disappear from view entirely. One more small fragment of London's enormous nighttime population that she will never think of again after tonight, glimpsed once and then gone, the way most of a crowded city's passing details tend to be. The theatre, when it comes into view, announces itself the way theatres of this era always did, through sheer, accumulated light. The facade is lined with gas fixtures and, increasingly common now, electric bulbs strung in patterns that would have seemed like sorcery to a Londoner of 50 years earlier, casting a steady white brilliance against the building's stone front that competes with, and in places overwhelms, the warmer gaslight of the surrounding street. A line of carriages stretches along the curb in both directions, each one disgorging its passengers in a slow, orderly sequence, footmen and doormen moving between them with the practiced choreography of people who do this every night of the season and have long since stopped finding it remarkable. Inside, past the marble foyer, the auditorium itself opens upward in tiers of red velvet seats and gilded boxes, rising toward a domed ceiling painted with some allegorical scene of muses and clouds that Evelyn has looked at perhaps 30 times in her life and could not, if pressed, accurately describe. The central chandelier hangs enormous and still unlit for now, waiting for full darkness before it dims, its hundreds of crystal drops catching whatever light already fills the room and scattering it back across the tiers below. Ushers in dark uniform move along the rows with programs and opera glasses for hire, murmuring directions to patrons still finding their seats, and somewhere below the stage, hidden from view, the low warming hum of an orchestra tuning its instruments drifts up through the general noise of a house not yet quite settled. The crowd moving toward the entrance is itself a kind of performance, and everyone in it seems at least partially aware of that fact. Men in evening dress, black and white, indistinguishable from a slight distance, in a way that makes the women beside them, in their deep reds and emeralds and blues, stand out all the more vividly. Fans, folded for now but ready to be opened the moment the theatre's warmth makes them necessary. Opera glasses, small and gleaming, tucked into evening bags or dangling from delicate chains, objects whose stated purpose was to see the stage more clearly, and whose actual purpose, more often than not, was to see the audience more clearly instead. Inside, the foyer opens into a wide, high-ceilinged space, marble underfoot, gilt on every surface that could plausibly hold it, and mirrors again, always mirrors, doing here exactly what they did at the restaurant, doubling the crowd, doubling the light, making the room feel twice as full and twice as bright as it actually is. The noise is different from the restaurant's low hum, louder, more layered, dozens of separate conversations overlapping, greetings called across the room, someone's laugh rising sharply above the general murmur before subsiding again. This, more than the performance itself, was very often the actual point of an evening at the theatre for people in Evelyn's position. Not that the plays or the operas were unimportant, not that nobody watched them with genuine attention, but the foyer, the intervals between acts, the slow procession to one's box or seat, functioned as a kind of extended, elegant marketplace of social visibility, where who stood with whom, who bowed to whom, who was seen entering which box, carried weight that lingered long after the final curtain. Her family's box, reached by a curving staircase carpeted in the same deep red as the restaurant's floor, sits on the second tier, positioned neither so high as to suggest diminished means, nor so prominently central as to suggest a family reaching above its actual standing, a precise calibration that her father had negotiated years earlier and maintained through the same box, the same tier, season after season, until the position itself had become a quiet, unspoken statement of exactly where the family belonged. Settling into the box, Evelyn has a clear view down into the stalls and across to the boxes on the opposite side, and it is there, glancing almost idly across the theatre's curved interior, that she sees him again. He's seated in a box perhaps 40 feet away, on the same tier, with an older woman beside him who is almost surely his mother, and another gentleman she does not immediately recognise. He's not looking toward her, engaged instead in some conversation with his companions, and she allows herself only a brief glance before returning her attention to her own box, to the low murmur of conversation around her. A woman 3 boxes down, apparently wearing last season's colour in a way that several people had already noticed and would go on discussing for days. The gaslight along the theatre's curved balconies has been turned low now, the enormous central chandelier still blazing, but the house lights beginning their slow dim in preparation for the performance to begin, and in that softened light, in that particular hush that falls over a crowded theatre, in its final moments before the curtain rises, Evelyn finds herself thinking, not for the first time this evening, about the strange arithmetic of an occasion like this one. An entire evening built around being seen, and yet the seeing itself so carefully rationed, so precisely governed, that a glance held a fraction too long could mean something, or could mean nothing at all, and there was no reliable way to know which. The foyer, in the minutes before the performance begins, offers its own particular education in exactly how much information a room full of strangers can silently exchange without a single direct conversation taking place. Evelyn watches as she waits near the base of the staircase for her father to finish his brief exchange with a colleague. The way clothing itself seems to sort the crowd into rough, overlapping categories almost automatically. Older married women in deep, rich colours, jewellery considerably more elaborate than anything an unmarried woman of Evelyn's age would wear. Diamonds and emeralds displayed with the settled confidence of women who no longer need to worry about appearing to reach above their station. Younger women, many of them clearly in their first or second season, dressed in the lighter, softer palette that fashion reserved for exactly that stage of life. Pale blues and blush pinks and the occasional daring cream, jewellery kept deliberately modest. A single strand of pearls, small drop earrings, nothing that could be read as presumptuous. The men, by contrast, offer considerably less variation. Black and white evening dress worn with only the smallest personal touches distinguishing one gentleman from the next. A particular style of collar, a certain way of tying the white tie at the throat, a boutonniere in a colour that hints, subtly, at some personal preference or affiliation. It had struck Evelyn once, years earlier, how strange it was that fashion asked so much visible, expensive labour of women and so comparatively little of men. A thought she had never quite managed to resolve into anything more useful than a mild recurring irritation. The sort of unfairness so thoroughly built into the world that pointing it out to anyone rarely seemed to accomplish much of anything. A gentleman near the staircase catches sight of an acquaintance across the crowded foyer and calls out a greeting loud enough to turn several heads, and the two men meet in the middle of the room with the easy, backslapping warmth that male friendship in this world seemed permitted to display considerably more openly than anything Evelyn or her female friends were ever encouraged toward. Two young women near the cloakroom exchange a rapid, low-voiced conversation behind partially raised fans, their eyes flicking, every few seconds, toward a particular gentleman standing near the entrance, a piece of social theatre so familiar to Evelyn from her own experience that she recognises its exact shape without needing to hear a single word of what they are actually saying. The bell rings its first warning, a soft, insistent chime somewhere near the auditorium doors, and the crowd begins its slow, reluctant migration toward the seats, conversations trailing off mid-sentence, small groups reluctantly dissolving with promises to continue the discussion at the interval. Evelyn follows her family up the curving staircase toward their box, glancing once briefly toward the opposite side of the theatre where she knows, without needing to look directly, that a particular box will soon hold a particular gentleman among its occupants, and feels for just a moment the specific pleasant flutter of anticipation that belongs entirely to evenings exactly like this one. The orchestra, tucked into a shallow pit just below the stage, had been playing quietly since well before the curtain rose, a light overture that most of the audience continued talking through, its purpose seemingly less to be listened to than to signal, gently, that the evening's more formal portion was about to begin. Evelyn had always rather liked this particular in-between moment, the house lights still up, the orchestra tuning and settling into its opening piece, the last stragglers hurrying to their seats along the rows, a kind of pleasant, unhurried anticipation that she suspected she enjoyed almost as much as the performance itself. The leading actress tonight, a woman whose name Evelyn recognised from at least 2 previous productions this same season, moved through her comic role with a lightness that drew genuine, unforced laughter from the audience rather than the polite, dutiful chuckling that a lesser performance sometimes earned. There was a particular scene midway through the first act, involving a case of mistaken letters and a flustered butler, that had the entire house laughing loudly enough that the actors themselves paused a beat longer than scripted, waiting for the noise to settle before continuing, a small, professional courtesy that Evelyn found herself admiring without quite knowing why. Between the comedy on stage and the equally elaborate performance unfolding across the boxes and stalls, Evelyn sometimes found it genuinely difficult to say which she found more entertaining, a thought she had confessed once, half-joking, to a friend, who had laughed and admitted to feeling exactly the same way. The stage told its story in careful, rehearsed lines and practiced comic timing. The audience told its own story too, in glances and bows and small, careful gestures, an entirely different and considerably less scripted performance that unfolded across the same 3 hours, with a cast considerably larger than the one currently taking its bows. The curtain rises on a play that Evelyn will, if she is honest with herself later, remember only in fragments, a comedy of manners set in a country house not unlike several she has actually visited, full of mistaken identities and a plot that resolves itself, predictably and pleasantly, in a wedding. The performances are competent, occasionally quite funny, and the audience laughs in the right places, applauds in the right places, and settles into the particular collective attention that a good comedy earns even from people who came primarily to be seen rather than to watch. She does not look toward the opposite box again during the first act. That restraint costs her something, a small private effort that nobody around her notices, and she is rather proud of it by the time the lights come up for the interval. The interval is where everything actually happens. A gentleman 2 boxes down, considerably older than Mr. Hartley and clearly well known to half the theatre, spends most of the interval moving between boxes with the easy confidence of a man who has long since stopped worrying about any of the careful calculations currently occupying Evelyn's own attention, bowing here, exchanging a joke there, entirely free of the elaborate machinery that governs every one of her own small gestures tonight. It occurs to her, watching him work the room with such visible ease, that this particular freedom belonged almost entirely to men of a certain age and standing, married or long past the age where marriage remained an urgent question, able to speak to nearly anyone without a single one of their words being weighed for hidden meaning afterward. She does not resent him for it exactly. It simply is what it is, one more small, unremarked upon asymmetry folded into an evening otherwise so carefully calibrated in every other respect. The house lights rise. Conversation erupts across the theatre almost instantly, and within moments the corridors behind the boxes fill with the low roar of several hundred people all deciding, simultaneously, whom to visit before the second act begins. Her father excuses himself to speak with a colleague 2 boxes down, and Evelyn stands near the front of the box, looking down into the stalls, when a voice she recognizes says her name from just behind her. It is not him, it is Mrs. Ashworth, a family friend of many years' standing, a woman whose social calendar is, by informal reputation, more extensive than anyone else's in their acquaintance, and whose presence at any gathering functions as a kind of social currency all its own. Beside her stands a gentleman Evelyn has not seen this evening, and beside him, having apparently drifted over from the neighbouring box during the general shuffle of the interval, stands the young man she has been trying, with only partial success, not to think about. Mrs. Ashworth, sensing an opportunity the way certain women of her generation always seem to sense such things, performs the introduction with practised ease. "This is Mr. Edward Hartley," she says, "whose mother I have known since we were girls together. Evelyn, this is Mr. Hartley." And there it is, the mechanism that had been missing all evening, the single ingredient without which nothing further could happen, now present, now complete. A mutual acquaintance, trusted by both families, has formally connected 2 names that had previously only existed near each other, never quite touching. This is worth pausing on, not because it is surprising exactly, but because it explains so much about how an entire evening like this one actually worked beneath its glittering surface. The introduction Mrs. Ashworth has just performed is not a formality in the way a modern handshake might be considered a formality, easily skipped, barely noticed. It is closer to a kind of social permission, a verification in effect, that Mr. Hartley is who he claims to be, that his family is what it appears to be, and that conversation between him and Evelyn can now proceed without either of them risking their reputation in the process. Mrs. Ashworth has, in the space of perhaps 8 seconds, done something that neither Evelyn nor Edward could have done for themselves, no matter how badly either of them might have wanted to. Mr. Hartley bows slightly, says something appropriately unremarkable about the play, and Evelyn responds in kind, and for the next several minutes the 4 of them stand together in a loose, easy conversation about the performance, about a mutual acquaintance's recent engagement, about the unseasonably mild weather London has enjoyed this autumn. Nothing in the conversation itself would strike a modern listener as anything beyond ordinary small talk, and that, precisely, is the point. Ordinary small talk, conducted properly, in the right company, at the right social distance, was the entire available vocabulary for 2 young unmarried people beginning to take an interest in one another. There was no other permitted register. Flirtation as a modern audience would recognize it, direct, teasing, personal, would have been considered wildly inappropriate for a first proper conversation between two people who had technically only just been introduced this same season. And yet something is clearly happening beneath the surface of the small talk, something both of them can feel and neither can name aloud. Mr. Hartley asks a slightly more specific question than strict politeness requires, about which parts of the play she found most amusing, and listens to her answer with an attention that goes a degree beyond simple courtesy. Evelyn, in turn, finds herself extending the conversation by half a sentence longer than necessary, offering a small observation about the leading actress that she had not planned to share with anyone. It is Mrs. Ashworth, watching this with the sharp, amused attention of a woman who has orchestrated exactly this kind of small collision more times than she could count, who eventually steers the conversation gently toward its close, mentioning that the bell will ring any moment now, that they had best return to their own box before the second act begins. Mr. Hartley bows again, expresses his pleasure at the introduction, and the small group dissolves back into the general current of the interval crowd. Evelyn returns to her seat with her heart beating very slightly faster than it had been 10 minutes earlier, a fact she would never mention to anyone, and that shows, if it shows at all, only in the particular brightness of her eyes for the remainder of the act. Let me explain what happens next, because this is the part that surprises people most when they first understand how the actual mechanics of Victorian courtship functioned among families like Evelyn's. Nothing happens next. Not tonight, at least. Not in the way a modern audience, trained by 2 centuries of romantic fiction to expect an immediate next scene, might hope for. What happens instead, over the following days and weeks, if anything happens at all, unfolds through an entirely different set of small, formal, deliberate steps, each one requiring patience that would strike most people today as almost unbearable. The first possible step, assuming Mr. Hartley's interest was genuine and not merely polite theatre conversation, would be a call, not a telephone call, since the telephone in 1896 remained a novelty confined mostly to business offices and a handful of wealthy households experimenting with the new technology, but a call in the older sense, a visit paid to the house, typically during the specific afternoon hours that a family had designated as their at-home time, hours printed, in some households, directly on the mother's calling card for exactly this purpose. Mr. Hartley, or more precisely his mother on his behalf, would need to already have some connection to Evelyn's household, or Mrs. Ashworth, having made the introduction, might extend that connection herself by suggesting a visit, by mentioning to Evelyn's father that the Hartleys were a family well worth knowing better. The calling card itself deserves a moment's attention, because it was not the trivial scrap of paper it might sound like. A gentleman's calling card, presented at the door by a servant and carried on a small silver tray to whichever member of the household was receiving, communicated an entire set of intentions through details as small as which corner might be folded, a practice that varied by household and by decade, but that, at its most formal, could signal condolence, congratulation, or simply that the caller had come in person rather than sending the card alone. If Evelyn was not receiving or did not wish to receive a particular caller, the card would be returned or simply not acknowledged with an invitation to call again, a rejection so quiet and so wrapped in polite ambiguity that an outside observer might never even notice it had happened, while the person on the receiving end understood perfectly well. If the visit went well, if Mr. Hartley was invited to call again, and if he did, a pattern might slowly establish itself, a sequence of afternoon visits, always chaperoned in the sense that Evelyn's father or another family member would typically be present in the room, or at the very least nearby, conversation kept to safe, general subjects, nothing that could be mistaken for anything beyond friendly acquaintance building carefully towards something more. An unmarried woman of Evelyn's age and standing was rarely left entirely alone with a gentleman she was not related to, not because anyone assumed the worst of either party, but because the mere appearance of impropriety, if noticed and repeated by the wrong person, could damage a reputation that had taken 27 years to build and could not easily be repaired once questioned. Letters might follow, eventually, though even these were governed by their own etiquette. A gentleman writing directly to an unmarried woman before any understanding existed between them risked being considered presumptuous, and a woman replying too readily risked appearing forward. Correspondence, when it did begin, often ran first through the safer channel of family friends, invitations extended jointly, notes about shared acquaintances, the actual content of budding personal feeling folded carefully inside the much larger envelope of ordinary social correspondence. And gossip, always gossip, moved faster than any of it. By the following afternoon, it is entirely possible that at least 2 or 3 people in Evelyn's circle would already know that she had been introduced to Mr. Hartley at the theatre, would already be speculating, in the mild, affectionate way that London society speculated about nearly everything, whether anything might come of it. This was not cruelty, it was simply how a society this interconnected processed information, the way water finds every available channel, and everyone inside it, Evelyn included, understood that whatever happened next would happen at least partially in public, observed, discussed, and quietly judged by people who would never say a single word about it directly to her face. None of this, it is worth saying clearly, made genuine affection impossible, or turned every courtship into pure calculation. Plenty of marriages in this era began exactly this way, with a chance introduction at a theatre or a ball, and grew, over months of carefully chaperoned visits and letters, into real and lasting attachment. The system was restrictive by any modern measure, but it was not designed to prevent feeling. It was designed to slow feeling down long enough for families, reputations, and financial futures to be properly considered before anything irreversible occurred, a kind of built-in patience that a modern eye might find frustrating, and that the people living inside it, for the most part, simply accepted as the natural order of how such things were done. The bell rings for the second act. Evelyn returns her attention, or tries to the stage below, though for the remainder of the performance her thoughts drift, more than once, back across the theatre to a box she does not allow herself to look toward again. Mrs. Ashworth herself, now that Evelyn thinks about it further while the second act settles back into motion around her, offers a useful example of exactly how much the rules could shift depending on who, precisely, a woman happened to be. She had been widowed some 11 years earlier, her husband a solicitor of comfortable means who had left her, upon his death, a settlement generous enough that she had never once needed to consider remarrying, purely for financial security, and she had, in the years since, built for herself a social existence that would have been entirely unavailable to a woman still young and unmarried. She travelled to the theatre most weeks with only a companion, sometimes with no companion at all, beyond her own maid waiting in the carriage. She dined, on occasion, at restaurants considerably less formal than the one Evelyn's family had visited earlier that evening, in the company of 2 or 3 other widowed friends, an arrangement that raised no eyebrows whatsoever among people who knew her, since her position, her age, and her long-established reputation had, together, earned her a kind of social latitude that a woman of 27 simply had not yet had time to earn. It was not, Evelyn understood, that the rules governing propriety had somehow stopped applying to Mrs. Ashworth. It was that the specific shape of what counted as proper shifted according to a woman's stage of life, her marital history, and the particular reputation she had spent years, sometimes decades, carefully building. A young unmarried woman's reputation was still, in the fullest sense, unwritten. Every choice she made read as evidence of who she might eventually turn out to be. A widow of established standing had already written most of her own story, and society, having read it and found nothing objectionable, extended her a trust that simply was not available to someone whose story had barely begun. Evelyn had sometimes wondered, in idle moments very much like this one, whether she looked forward to eventually reaching that same settled latitude herself, some 15 or 20 years from now, freed from the particular careful vigilance that governed every one of her evenings currently, or whether, by the time she reached it, she would find herself missing this exact stretch of her life, its heightened attention, its careful uncertainty, the specific electric quality that came from every gesture still mattering enormously simply because so little about her own future had yet been decided. She suspected, watching Mrs. Ashworth now from across the box, deep in comfortable conversation with a companion of her own choosing, that the answer was probably both at once, a freedom worth wanting, and a particular kind of aliveness worth missing, the way most genuine trade-offs in a life eventually turned out to be. During that same interval, before the second act began, Evelyn had also exchanged a brief word with another old acquaintance, a young woman named Frances who had come out the same season as Evelyn herself, and who was now, everyone understood without anyone needing to say so directly, moving through her third season with no engagement yet to show for it, a fact that hovered around every conversation involving her like a faint, unspoken weight that Frances herself handled with a brightness Evelyn privately admired. There had been, apparently, a promising understanding the previous season, a young officer whose attentions had seemed, for several months, to be building steadily towards something more formal, calls made regularly, an exchange of letters that Frances had once, in a rare unguarded moment, described to Evelyn as considerably warmer than propriety strictly required, and then, without any dramatic rupture that Evelyn had ever heard properly explained, the calls had simply stopped, the letters grown shorter, and then ceased altogether, and by the following season the young officer had become engaged instead to a woman from an entirely different circle, one whose family connections, it was generally understood, had offered him rather more than Frances's family could. Frances had weathered this with a composure that Evelyn found genuinely admirable, never once complaining publicly, never allowing the disappointment to show in anything beyond the smallest, most private moments, continuing to attend every ball and dinner and theatre evening with exactly the same bright, engaged energy she had always brought to such occasions, though Evelyn suspected, watching her friend now across the crowded interval, that something in her had grown just slightly more guarded since that particular season, a small, careful reserve tucked beneath the brightness that had not been there 2 years earlier. It was a reminder, standing there with Frances for those few minutes, of exactly how much could go wrong along the careful path that Evelyn herself had only just begun walking with Mr. Hartley, how many promising beginnings simply dissolved into nothing through no particular fault of anyone involved, how thoroughly a young woman's romantic future in this world remained subject to forces considerably larger than her own feelings, family finances, family connections, the simple, unpredictable chemistry of whether two families happen to like each other as much as two individuals happen to like each other. Frances had done everything correctly. She had followed every rule, made every proper gesture, and it had come to nothing anyway, and there was no guarantee at all that Evelyn's own evening, however promising it currently felt, would end any differently. And yet Evelyn found, thinking about this now in the quiet of her own dark bedroom, that Frances's disappointment did not frighten her nearly as much as it might have a year earlier. There was something almost bracing in understanding clearly, through a friend's honest example, exactly how uncertain the whole system actually was, a kind of permission, oddly enough, to enjoy tonight's small hopeful signals exactly as much as they deserved to be enjoyed, without needing to weight them down in advance with more certainty than they could reasonably bear. The second act, when it finally resumes, settles into its own comfortable rhythm, the comedy's various misunderstandings beginning their slow unwind toward the wedding everyone in the audience has correctly predicted since roughly the middle of the first act. Evelyn watches with genuine enjoyment, laughing at the same lines that draw laughter from the rest of the house, and yet some quiet portion of her attention keeps drifting every few minutes back across the theatre to a box she has promised herself she will not look toward again, a promise she keeps only about half the time. Her father, beside her, appears fully absorbed in the performance, occasionally chuckling a half-beat after the rest of the house, in the particular way of a man enjoying himself thoroughly without quite admitting how much. There had been, too, a moment during the second act, easy to miss amid the play's building comedy, when Evelyn had glanced down into the stalls and noticed an elderly gentleman dozing quite openly in his seat, his programme slipping slowly from his lap, while his wife beside him pretended, with visible effort, not to notice. Evelyn had felt an unexpected fondness for the small scene, a reminder that even an evening as carefully polished as this one held room for something as unglamorous and as entirely human as an old man falling asleep during a comedy he had likely already seen several times before, in exactly this theatre, across exactly this many years of exactly this same fashionable season repeating itself, year after year, for everyone eventually, in one form or another. The second act resolves its tangled plot exactly as comedies of this kind always do, misunderstandings clarified, the right couples paired off, a final scene played mostly for laughter that lands well enough to send the audience out into the corridors afterward still smiling, still discussing favourite lines. The applause, when it comes, is warm and sustained. The actors called back twice for bows, and then the house lights rise fully and the enormous glittering machine of departure begins. Leaving a theatre after the final curtain was, in its own way, as choreographed as arriving had been, though considerably more crowded and considerably less orderly. Hundreds of people funneled toward the same staircases at once, evening wraps retrieved, gloves checked, small parties reassembling themselves out of the general crush the way families do at the end of any large gathering, calling names, catching sleeves, moving in loose clusters toward whichever exit their carriage has been instructed to wait near. Evelyn descends the staircase on her own, scanning the crowd without quite admitting to herself that she is scanning it, and near the base of the stairs, in the general crush of departing theatre-goers, she sees Mr. Hartley once more, briefly, across perhaps 15 feet of moving bodies. He notices her at nearly the same moment, and there is time only for a small polite bow, returned by an equally small polite inclination of her head, before the crowd carries each of them in a different direction, toward different exits, different carriages, different corners of a London night that suddenly feels, to Evelyn at least, considerably larger and more interesting than it did 3 hours earlier. There is a brief moment in the crush near the stairs when Evelyn catches sight of Frances again, gathering her own wrap with the same easy brightness she carries into every room regardless of what she is actually feeling underneath it, and the two exchange a quick, warm smile across several feet of moving bodies before the crowd separates them entirely. Evelyn finds herself hoping, in the brief half-second available for such a thought, that Frances's own evening holds something worth smiling about beyond simple good manners, though there is no way to know, not from here, not in a crowd this thick and this determined to get everyone out into the night at once. This is, in fact, precisely how a great deal of Victorian courtship actually functioned, in fragments like this one, brief and public and heavily witnessed. A glance held a half-second longer than strictly necessary, a bow performed with just slightly more attention than etiquette required, each fragment meaning almost nothing on its own, and everything in accumulation. Nobody watching that brief exchange at the base of the staircase would have described anything as having happened, and yet something had unmistakably happened, at least to the two people involved in it. Outside, the theatre district has entered its busiest hour. The street is a solid moving mass of carriages, hansoms weaving between the larger private vehicles with an agility their drivers seem to take particular pride in, doormen and policemen both working to keep some semblance of order in the crush. It has begun to rain, lightly, the kind of fine London rain that seems to arrive from everywhere at once, rather than falling in any particular direction, and umbrellas open across the crowd in a sudden dark blooming, doormen extending their own to shelter departing patrons the final few steps to their waiting carriages. This is worth a moment's attention too, because weather like this reveals something about the actual texture of privilege in a city like London. For most of the crowd currently hurrying toward omnibuses and hansom cabs, a sudden rain meant getting wet, meant a damp walk to the nearest stop, meant an evening's finery arriving home slightly worse for the experience. For Evelyn, it meant almost nothing at all. A footman, or in this case simply the family coachman stepping down at exactly the right moment, held an umbrella steady over her head for the 6 or 7 steps between the theatre's awning and the carriage door, and she settled into the dry, warm interior of the family carriage, having encountered the rain only as a sound against the window rather than a sensation against her skin. The hansom cab, cheaper, faster, more exposed, driven by a single horse and open at the front in a way that suited fair weather considerably better than foul, was not really an option that occurred to her family at all tonight, not because it would have been improper exactly, but because it would have been in every practical sense beneath what a family of their means and standing would choose when better alternatives existed. A private carriage insulated its passengers not only from rain, but from the entire unpredictable texture of the street, the noise, the crowding, the small negotiations over fare and destination that anyone hailing a public conveyance had to manage themselves. Tonight, though, the evening is not yet finished. There is one more destination, a late supper at a small exclusive establishment favoured by exactly the kind of fashionable young crowd currently pouring out of the West End's theatres, a place where the evening's remaining energy, the last of the interval's conversations and half-formed introductions, tends to gather and continue for another hour or two before London finally, gradually, begins to quiet. The carriage moves through streets considerably less crowded now than they were 3 hours earlier, though far from empty, past restaurants whose windows still glow though their busiest hour has clearly passed, past a hotel entrance where a uniformed doorman stands beneath an awning watching the rain, past shuttered shops whose daytime business has given way entirely to the different, later economy of London after dark. The rain, by the time they reach the supper-room street, has softened further still into something closer to mist, fine enough that it barely wets the pavement anymore, and the particular hush it leaves behind, streets glistening faintly under gaslight, footsteps landing slightly softer than they would on dry stone, gives this last stretch of the evening a quality Evelyn has always privately loved without ever quite finding the right word for it. Hushed, perhaps, or simply softened, the whole city's harder edges rounded off just slightly by a few hours of gentle weather, everything a touch more forgiving than it had been earlier under the sharper, busier light of the fashionable dinner hour. Within 10 minutes the carriage slows again, and Evelyn steps down into a narrower, quieter street than the theatre district, one lined with smaller, more discreet establishments that cater almost exclusively to precisely this crowd, people who have just left a fashionable evening and are not yet ready for it to end. The supper room, when they enter it, feels different in scale from the grand dining room of earlier in the evening, more intimate, lower ceilinged, lit almost entirely by candlelight rather than the harsher, brighter combination of gas and electric that had illuminated the restaurant 3 hours before. Perhaps 30 tables fill the space, most of them already occupied by exactly the kind of well-dressed young crowd that has been circulating through London's theatres and restaurants all evening, a great deal of low, easy laughter, the particular loosened formality that settles over a room once the evening's more rigid social obligations, the dinner with its careful seating, the theatre with its careful boxes, have both been satisfied, and something more relaxed can finally take their place. A pianist somewhere near the room's far corner plays something low and unobtrusive, more felt than actually listened to, threading through the general noise of conversation and cutlery, the way music in rooms exactly like this one always seemed to, present enough to soften the silences between sentences, quiet enough that nobody could later say what tune it had actually been. Waiters moved between the tables with trays held high, oysters on beds of crushed ice, thin-cut bread and butter, small glasses of something pale and sparkling that caught the candlelight every time a tray passed beneath one of the room's low-hanging lamps. Along the walls, framed prints of racehorses and hunting scenes gave the room a slightly different character than the grander restaurant of earlier in the evening, less formal, more like the inside of an exceptionally well-appointed club than a public dining room, though the prices, Evelyn suspected without ever having reason to actually see a bill, ran every bit as high. Dining out itself, in the particular fashionable sense that had brought Evelyn's family to that glittering restaurant earlier in the evening, was a considerably newer habit than most people assumed, newer, in fact, than Evelyn's own grandmother, who had grown up in a London where a respectable family simply did not eat its evening meal anywhere but its own dining room, and not somewhere so publicly visible as a restaurant, an institution her grandmother's generation had associated, not entirely fairly, with a slightly disreputable continental habit unsuited to proper English domestic life. That attitude had shifted gradually, and then quite suddenly over the preceding 20 or 30 years, as a handful of ambitious hoteliers and restaurateurs had begun building dining rooms, specifically designed to overcome exactly that old resistance, spaces so lavish, so carefully appointed, so thoroughly respectable in their carpets and their crystal and their deferential service, that dining there came to feel, for families like Evelyn's, not like a departure from proper domestic standards at all, but like an extension of them, a private drawing room simply relocated, for one evening, into a grander and more public setting. The great London hotels had led the way, their dining rooms functioning almost as demonstration pieces for exactly how elegant, how controlled, how entirely free of impropriety public dining could actually be, and independent restaurants of genuine ambition had followed close behind, competing for precisely the same fashionable, reputation-conscious clientele. By the time Evelyn was old enough to be included in such evenings herself, the entire question had already been settled in favour of restaurants, at least for families of her particular standing and inclination. Dining out transformed from a mild social risk into something closer to its opposite, a mark of fashionable modernity, evidence that a family moved comfortably in exactly the right circles, knew exactly which establishments were currently considered worth being seen in, and could afford, without a second thought, the considerable expense that a meal in a room like the one they had dined in tonight actually represented. Older women in her circle still occasionally referenced, half fondly and half critically, the stricter domestic standards of their own girlhoods, a gentle running commentary on how much had changed within a single generation, delivered in the particular tone of women who had adapted to the change completely, and yet still felt some private loyalty to the older world they had grown up inside. Evelyn, for her part, had never known anything else, restaurant dining simply one thread among many in the fashionable season's larger fabric, and she found it difficult, when she tried, to fully imagine her grandmother's London, a city where an evening exactly like tonight's would have seemed not merely unusual but faintly improper, evidence of a family either unable or unwilling to maintain a proper household of its own. This was, she supposed, simply how an entire world's unwritten rules tended to move across time, not through any single dramatic announcement, but through this same slow generational drift, one era's mild scandal quietly becoming the next era's unremarkable fashion, until eventually nobody currently living could quite remember why anyone had ever objected in the first place. They are seated at a small round table near the room's centre, her father having secured the reservation days earlier through the same quiet network of acquaintance and habit that governed nearly every arrangement of the evening. A waiter appears almost immediately with a short, elegant menu, considerably shorter than the one at the earlier restaurant, since a supper like this one was never meant to rival dinner in scale, only to extend the evening's pleasure a little further before everyone finally went home. There are oysters arranged on a bed of crushed ice, a dozen to a plate, briny and cold, and eaten with nothing more than a squeeze of lemon and a small silver fork designed for exactly this purpose. There is a light consommé for anyone who wants something warm. There are thin slices of cold game, pheasant left over, in the culinary sense, from the kitchen's earlier dinner service, but reimagined here as something delicate and celebratory rather than merely practical. There is champagne, of course. Nearly every table in the room has a bottle of it cooling in a silver bucket, and it arrives at theirs within minutes of the oysters, poured into tall, narrow glasses that catch the candlelight in a way that seems designed specifically for rooms exactly like this one. Evelyn eats an oyster, finds it colder and more startling on the tongue than she expected, and catches her father's small, amused look across the table, the particular expression of a man who has watched her have that exact reaction more than once before, and finds it, every time, quietly delightful. A second waiter arrives shortly after, with a small dish of something Evelyn does not immediately recognize, thin slivers of smoked salmon rolled delicately around a filling she cannot quite name, and her father, noticing her hesitation, explains with visible enjoyment that it had become something of a fashionable addition to menus exactly like this one over the past year or two, imported partly from continental habits and partly, he suspects, from nothing more than one influential hostess deciding it ought to be fashionable and the rest of London quietly agreeing with her. Evelyn tries it, finds it richer and saltier than expected, and decides after a moment's consideration that she rather likes it, filing the dish away as something worth requesting again the next time an evening exactly like this one presents itself. It is perhaps 20 minutes into the meal, during a lull in her parents' conversation with an older couple who have stopped by their table to exchange greetings, that Evelyn becomes aware, without quite looking directly, that Mr. Hartley has entered the room. He is with the same two companions from the theatre, and they are shown to a table not far from her own, close enough that a properly directed glance could easily reach it. He notices her within moments of sitting, and this time, with the day's formal introduction now behind them, a small acknowledgement passes between them that would have been impossible 3 hours earlier. A nod, a slight smile, the kind of gesture that requires no further explanation, and that neither of their parents, watching from a comfortable social distance, would think twice about. He does not approach the table. That too would have required a further layer of permission that a single interval introduction had not yet provided. An invitation from her father, perhaps, or a second, more deliberate meeting arranged through Mrs. Ashworth or some other mutual connection. But the small exchange, brief as it is, carries its own weight, and Evelyn finds herself, for the remainder of the meal, more aware than usual of the room's temperature, of the particular way candlelight moves across white linen, of how long 20 minutes can feel when a person is trying very hard not to seem as though they are counting them. Let me say a little more here about where all of this was actually heading, because it is worth understanding the fuller shape of the road that a moment like tonight's sat at the very beginning of. If Mr. Hartley's interest continued, if the visits that might follow in the coming weeks proceeded well, if both families found the match agreeable, financially sensible and socially appropriate, an understanding might eventually develop between the two young people, something rarely announced formally at first, but understood within their immediate circle through the accumulated weight of visits, letters, and the particular way two names had begun appearing together at the same events. An actual engagement, when it came, was typically preceded by a private conversation, sometimes between the gentleman and the young woman herself, though quite often the more consequential conversation happened first between the gentleman and the young woman's father, a discussion that touched as much on finances, settlements, and family expectations as it did on affection, since marriage among families of this standing remained, whatever the personal feeling involved, fundamentally an economic and social alliance as well as a romantic one. Once an engagement was formally settled and announced, considerably more freedom opened up almost overnight. An engaged couple could be seen together in public, with far less chaperoning than an unengaged couple, could correspond freely, could, within certain limits, spend time together that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. The engagement period itself typically lasted anywhere from a few months to the better part of a year, time enough for the practical machinery of a Victorian wedding, the settlements, the trousseau, the endless correspondence with relatives, to be properly assembled. None of this, it should be said, was purely mercenary or loveless, whatever a modern reader might assume from the sheer amount of financial and social calculation woven through it. Families like Evelyn's did care, genuinely, about whether a match made their daughter happy, and plenty of young women in her position had, over the preceding decades, refused perfectly sensible proposals from perfectly respectable men simply because the feeling was not there. What the system did was slow everything down, insert layer after layer of family oversight and social visibility between attraction and commitment in a way that a modern eye, accustomed to considerably faster and more private courtships, might find almost unbearably deliberate. Evelyn does not know, sitting at this small round table with a half-finished glass of champagne in front of her, whether any of that particular road lies ahead of her and Mr. Hartley. It is far too soon to know anything at all. What she does know, or at least suspects, is that something about this particular evening will be remembered later as a beginning, whatever it turns out to be the beginning of. The supper continues another half hour, the room's energy gradually softening as tables begin to empty around them, parties settling their accounts and gathering wraps, the particular late-night quiet that eventually settles over even the liveliest room beginning, slowly, to arrive here too. By the time Evelyn's own family rises to leave, the crowd has thinned considerably, perhaps a third of the tables now empty, and the waiters move with the loosened, unhurried pace of a service nearing its close for the night. Mr. Hartley's table rises at almost the same moment, whether by simple coincidence of timing or something less coincidental. Evelyn does not allow herself to speculate. There is a final exchange of bows near the door, brief, entirely proper, witnessed by both sets of parents without a flicker of concern, and then the two parties step out into the night through the same door, a few moments apart, dispersing toward their own waiting carriages on a street that has grown noticeably quieter even in the short time they were inside. The supper room holds a different kind of energy than either the restaurant or the theatre had held earlier, looser, later, populated almost entirely by people who had just come from somewhere else, theatre programs still tucked into evening bags, opera glasses set down beside champagne glasses, the particular loosened conversation of people whose most demanding social obligations for the evening have already been satisfied, and who can now simply enjoy themselves for the hour or two remaining before the night finally, properly ends. 2 tables away, a young couple whose engagement had apparently been announced only that week were receiving a steady stream of well-wishers, friends stopping by their table in ones and twos to offer congratulations, the young woman's face bright with a particular kind of happiness that Evelyn found herself watching for slightly longer than strict discretion required, wondering, in the same idle way she had wondered about Mrs. Ashworth's freedoms earlier, what it might feel like to have arrived at that exact point in the long, careful sequence that had occupied so much of her own evening's attention. Nearer the door, a party of 4 young men, clearly fresh from some club or another, before joining the general drift towards supper, laughed loudly over some shared joke that Evelyn could not hear the substance of, their table considerably rowdier than most of the others in the room, and drawing, from an older couple seated nearby, the occasional small glance of mild, indulgent disapproval. A woman in deep blue silk, seated alone at a small table near the far wall, with what appeared to be a female companion rather than any male escort, caught Evelyn's attention briefly, an arrangement unusual enough that she found herself curious about the specifics of it, without any real way to satisfy that curiosity. Perhaps a widow, moving through exactly the kind of independence Mrs. Ashworth herself enjoyed. Perhaps something else entirely, some circumstance Evelyn could not guess at from 30 feet away and a single glance. The room held dozens of small stories exactly like that one tonight, visible only in fragments, each table its own brief chapter in some longer narrative that Evelyn would never actually learn the ending of, glimpsed once across a crowded room and then left behind forever when the evening finally ended and everyone dispersed to their own separate lives. The waiters here moved with a different rhythm than the more formal restaurant staff of earlier, quicker, lighter on their feet, accustomed to a crowd that wanted its champagne poured promptly and its oysters delivered without excessive ceremony, the whole room operating on an understanding that its particular hour of the night called for efficiency wrapped in charm rather than the slower, more theatrical service that had characterized dinner. A small clock above the door, gilt-framed and barely noticed by most of the room's occupants, ticked steadily past 11, then toward past, marking a stretch of the evening that existed almost entirely outside the ordinary rhythms of the day, a pocket of borrowed time that fashionable London carved out for itself several nights a week throughout the season, enjoyed fully and then abandoned completely once its natural hour had passed. The carriage door closes with its familiar soft click, and for the first time all evening there is nowhere else to be, no restaurant waiting, no theatre bell about to ring, no supper table expecting them, only the ride home now, and then the house, and then, eventually, sleep. Her father settles back against the seat with a small contented exhale, the particular quiet of a man who has performed his own social duties well, and can finally, for these last few minutes, stop performing them. He is already half occupied with some thought of his own, the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between 2 people who have spent a great many years together and no longer feel any obligation to fill every available moment with conversation. Evelyn turns toward the window. London outside looks almost nothing like the city she watched slide past 3.5 hours earlier. The theatre district's dense, glittering crush has thinned into something quieter, more spaced out, the crowds of earlier reduced now to smaller, scattered groups making their own way home, a few last hansoms rattling past with tired-looking horses, an omnibus long since finished for the night, its route ended, its lamps dark, parked at some yard on the outskirts of the city where it will wait for the morning's first passengers. The rain has softened into something barely more than mist, fine enough that it catches the gaslight in a faint golden haze rather than falling in any visible line, and the pavement beneath it gleams wet and dark, doubling every lamp above it into a small, wavering reflection. The carriage moves at an easy, unhurried pace now, no need to compete with a dense crowd of other vehicles, and the sound inside the compartment settles into something almost hypnotic. The steady rhythm of hooves against wet stone, the occasional creak of the carriage's frame taking a slight turn, the faint jingle of harness metal keeping its own quiet time beneath everything else. It is, Evelyn thinks, a sound she has heard perhaps 1,000 times in her life and has almost never actually listened to, and tonight, for whatever reason, she listens to it properly, lets it fill the small space where her thoughts had been racing only 20 minutes earlier. They pass a policeman standing beneath a lamppost at a quiet corner, his breath visible now in the cooling night air, watching the empty street with the same patient stillness he probably held 6 hours ago when the street was anything but empty. They pass a small church, its windows dark, its railings glistening faintly with the last of the mist. They pass a house with a single lit window on its upper floor, someone awake behind it for reasons Evelyn will never know, a doctor's late visit perhaps, or simply someone who cannot sleep, and she finds herself wondering, briefly and without any particular reason, what story might be unfolding behind that one small square of yellow light before the carriage carries her past it, and the thought dissolves. This late, London reveals a texture that daytime London and even early evening London never quite show. The great restless machinery of the city, its shops and offices and omnibuses and hurrying pedestrians, has mostly stopped for the night, and what remains feels almost intimate by comparison, a handful of lit windows, a scattering of figures moving unhurriedly along nearly empty pavements, the city reduced to something closer to its bones. Gas lamps stand at their regular intervals down every street they pass, each one casting the same steady, warm circle of light onto the same few feet of pavement, a pattern repeated so many thousands of times across the city that it becomes, in the half-asleep rhythm of a late carriage ride, almost like a kind of counting, one lamp and then another, marking the distance home in small, glowing increments. Here and there, newer streets carry the different, whiter glow of electric lighting instead, a technology still spreading gradually across London's more fashionable districts throughout these years, not yet universal, coexisting for now with the older gas system in a way that gives different streets, even streets only a few minutes apart, distinctly different characters after dark. Evelyn has grown up watching this change happen gradually around her, a new installation here, another there, without anyone quite announcing that anything historic was occurring, the way most change actually happens, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow accumulation of small replacements, until one day the old way is simply gone, and nobody remembers exactly when. The carriage crosses a wider street where a night watchman stands outside a darkened shop, his lantern set on the ground beside him, and for a moment Evelyn catches his eye through the carriage window, a brief, meaningless exchange of glances between two strangers who will never see each other again, and then the carriage has moved on, and the watchman has already returned his attention to whatever he was watching before. Her father continues to look out his own window in silence, and Evelyn is left, for these last several minutes of the ride, essentially alone with her own thoughts despite sitting only a few feet away from him. She thinks about the oysters, cold and strange on her tongue. She thinks about the sapphires on the woman 2 tables over at dinner, wondering idly whether they were real or paste, a question she will never have answered and does not particularly need to have answered. She thinks, more than she means to, about a small round table near the centre of a candlelit supper room, and a nod exchanged across perhaps 20 feet of space, and how strange it is that something so small could occupy so much of an evening's remaining attention. There is a particular kind of tiredness that settles into a body after an evening like this one, not the sharp exhaustion of physical labour, since Evelyn has done nothing tonight that could reasonably be called labour at all, but something softer and more diffuse, the accumulated weight of hours spent sitting straight, speaking carefully, smiling at the correct moments, holding herself in the particular composed posture that an evening of continuous social visibility demands. It is a tiredness located as much in the mind as in the body, the specific fatigue of a person who has been in one sense or another performing for the better part of 4 hours, and who can only now, in the enclosed privacy of a dark carriage moving through empty streets, allow herself to stop. The streets grow more familiar as they near Mayfair, the particular quiet, orderly geometry of these residential blocks distinct even at night from the busier commercial streets they passed through earlier. Fewer lamps here, spaced generously along wide, tree-lined pavements, most of the tall townhouses dark now, their occupants long since retired for the evening, though here and there a single window still glows, someone's study lamp left burning, a nursery light kept low through the night for a child who does not like complete darkness. The carriage slows. Evelyn recognizes the particular sequence of houses that means they are nearly home, a bend in the street, a corner house with a distinctive black iron gate, and then, finally, their own front door, lit by a single lamp beside it that has been burning, she knows, since before they left, kept alight for exactly this moment of return. There had been talk, earlier in the week, of a proper fog settling over London, the thick, yellowish kind that occasionally rolled in off the river and swallowed entire streets whole for a day or two at a time, thick enough that carriages sometimes needed a servant walking ahead with a lantern simply to find the correct turning, thick enough that theatres and restaurants occasionally saw their evening trade thin considerably as families decided, reasonably, that the risk and discomfort of travelling through it outweighed whatever pleasure waited at the other end. Tonight, mercifully, had brought nothing worse than the earlier light rain, the air clear enough by the time they left the supper room for the street lamps to throw their usual clean, steady light rather than the diffused, ghostly halo that thick fog produced. But Evelyn had experienced enough foggy London evenings in her life to feel a small, private gratitude for the clear air tonight, a gratitude so automatic she barely registered it as a distinct thought at all. She remembered one particular fog, 2 winters earlier, so dense that her family's own carriage had lost its bearings only 3 streets from home. The coachman forced to stop entirely and send a footman ahead on foot to locate the correct corner by touch and memory rather than sight, the whole household arriving home nearly an hour later than expected. Her own evening gloves faintly yellowed afterward by the particular sulphurous residue that London's worst fogs left on anything exposed to them for too long. It was, she supposed, one of the genuine costs of living in a city built on this much coal smoke, one of the few forces powerful enough to occasionally override even the careful, controlled comfort that wealth otherwise provided so reliably, since a fog thick enough did not particularly care whose carriage it was slowing, whose evening it was disrupting. The policeman they passed near the theatre earlier, standing his patient watch beneath a gas lamp, represented another quiet piece of the same larger machinery that made an evening like tonight's possible at all. London's metropolitan force having grown, over the preceding decades, into a visible, steady presence across exactly the fashionable districts where families like Evelyn's spent their evenings, walking fixed beats, checking locked doors, watching the flow of carriages and pedestrians with an attention that most people passing them never consciously registered and yet relied upon completely. Evelyn had never once in her entire life had cause to feel unsafe on a fashionable London street after dark, and she understood, in the same distant way she understood so much of the machinery supporting her own comfortable existence, that this feeling of safety was not simply a natural feature of the city itself, but something built, deliberately, through gaslight and regular patrol, and a private carriage waiting exactly where it was supposed to wait, an entire quiet infrastructure of protection that made itself felt only in its absence, on the rare occasions when something reminded her, briefly, that it existed at all. Here is something worth understanding properly, because it explains why an evening like this one could exist at all in the form it did, and it has to do with light itself, and with how recently London had learnt to hold back the dark. For most of the city's long history, night had meant something considerably simpler and considerably less forgiving than it meant now, in this particular decade. Darkness fell, and with it fell most of what a respectable household considered acceptable activity outside its own walls, streets lit poorly, or not at all, travel after sunset a matter of private lanterns and considerable caution, entire swaths of the city effectively closed for business the moment the sun went down. That world had not vanished completely, not everywhere, not for everyone, but for the particular stretch of London that Evelyn had spent her evening moving through, the fashionable core of the West End. It had been transformed almost beyond recognition over the span of less than a single lifetime. Gaslighting had arrived first, spreading gradually through London's streets over the preceding decades until, by the time Evelyn was born, it had become so completely ordinary a feature of the city that nobody she knew could remember it as a novelty at all, simply an assumed fact of urban life, the same way running water or a properly swept street was assumed. Each lamp burned through a small, steady jet of gas piped in from works on the city's outskirts, lit each evening and extinguished each morning by lamplighters who walked their assigned routes with a long pole, a job so routine and so unremarked upon that most Londoners, Evelyn very much included, had genuinely never once stopped to watch one of them work, despite having relied on the results of that work every single night of their lives. Electric lighting was newer, considerably newer, and its spread across London during Evelyn's own lifetime had been visible in a way gas's earlier spread had not, precisely because she was old enough now to actually notice the change happening around her. It had begun, as these things generally did, with the grandest and most visible spaces first. Certain theatres, certain hotels, a handful of the most fashionable shops along the busiest streets, all of them eager to advertise, through the sheer brightness and steadiness of their new white light, exactly how current, how forward-looking, how thoroughly modern they intended to be. The theatre Evelyn had visited tonight used electric light throughout its foyer and auditorium now, though its dressing rooms and certain back corridors, she had heard, still relied on the older gas fixtures, the two systems coexisting within a single building, the way they coexisted across the wider city, old and new running side by side for years, sometimes decades, before one finally, quietly, replaced the other completely. The practical effect of all this accumulated light, gas and electric together was something that would have seemed almost impossible to a Londoner living 100 years earlier, an entire fashionable district of the city that functioned for several hours every evening, almost as fully and as safely as it functioned during the day, at least for people moving through it with the right resources and the right company. Shop windows stayed illuminated well past closing simply to display their wares to the evening crowd strolling past on their way to dinner. Restaurant fronts blazed with light specifically designed to draw the eye from half a street away. Theatre marquees announced themselves in brightness that could be seen from considerable distance, a kind of visual advertisement that daylight itself could never quite achieve with the same drama. And this transformed light had in turn transformed what an evening could actually be. 100 years earlier, an evening like Evelyn's, dinner, theatre, a late supper afterward, stretching from 6 in the evening past midnight, would have required a level of private illumination, private security, and private transportation so considerable that only the very grandest households could have managed it at all, and even then only with a certain nervous caution about what the darker stretches of any journey might hold. Now, moving through a fashionable London lit almost continuously by gas and electricity together, protected by a visible and regular police presence, ferried between destinations in a private carriage that never had to travel more than a few minutes through any genuinely dark or unlit stretch of street, an evening like this one had become, for people exactly like Evelyn, remarkably safe, remarkably comfortable, and remarkably unremarkable, despite representing in truth an enormous and quite recent transformation in what London after dark actually was. Not every part of London had transformed equally, of course, and Evelyn understood this in the same distant, abstract way she understood the economics of her own wardrobe, a fact acknowledged without ever being felt directly. Whole districts beyond the fashionable core remained lit far more sparsely, their streets after dark considerably less safe, considerably less inviting, a version of London that existed only a few miles from Mayfair and yet belonged, in every practical sense, to an entirely different city, one Evelyn would likely never see after dark in her entire life, not because anyone forbade her from seeing it, but because nothing in her carefully arranged existence would ever direct her carriage down those particular streets. The West End she moved through tonight was, in other words, not simply London after dark. It was a very specific, very carefully lit and carefully policed and carefully curated version of London after dark, built up gradually over recent decades specifically to accommodate people exactly like her, and how entirely natural it felt to Evelyn, how completely unremarkable, was itself perhaps the clearest evidence of just how successfully that particular transformation had been achieved. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of this final ride home, to think a little more about the actual mechanics of getting anywhere in London after dark, because the choice of carriage said almost as much about a person as the clothes they wore inside it. A private carriage, like the one carrying Evelyn and her parents home tonight, represented the top of a fairly clear hierarchy. It was owned outright, or at least the horses and the carriage house were, which meant an ongoing expense, stabling, feed, a coachman's wages, that placed it well beyond the reach of most London households regardless of how comfortably those households otherwise lived. It offered privacy, protection from weather, and a particular kind of unhurried control over one's own schedule that no rented vehicle could quite match, since it waited exactly as long as its owners needed it to wait, arrived exactly where they needed it to arrive, and never required haggling over a fare. Below that sat the hansom cab, that distinctive two-wheeled vehicle, with its driver perched high and visible above and slightly behind the passenger compartment, fast, relatively cheap, and available on nearly any busy street simply by raising a hand. A gentleman travelling alone, or a small group of men leaving a club late at night, might hail a hansom without a second thought. For an unmarried woman travelling alone, however, the calculation was different, not because hansoms themselves were considered dangerous exactly, but because a young woman of good family, riding unaccompanied in a hired public vehicle, especially after dark, risked exactly the kind of ambiguous appearance that a family like Evelyn's worked so hard to avoid. It was not that anything improper would necessarily happen, it was that nobody could vouch for what had or had not happened, and in a social world built so heavily on reputation and appearance, that absence of a witness was itself a kind of risk. Omnibuses sat lower still on this particular hierarchy, cheap, slow, crowded, following fixed routes rather than responding to individual need, patronised largely by clerks and shop workers and the broader middle ranks of London's working population, rather than by fashionable society, though a family's own servants might well use exactly this kind of transport on their days off, moving through a version of the city that operated in practice almost entirely separately from the one Evelyn had spent her evening inside. And then there was walking, the simplest option of all and, in certain respects, the most restricted. A wealthy woman could walk perfectly respectably through Mayfair or the fashionable parts of the West End during daylight hours, often accompanied by a maid or a female companion for propriety's sake on longer outings, strolling through the park at the fashionable hour when half of society turned out specifically to see and be seen doing exactly that. After dark, though, the calculation shifted considerably. An unaccompanied woman walking London streets late at night, however respectable her intentions, risked being mistaken, at a glance, for exactly the kind of woman whose presence on those same streets after dark had a very different reputation attached to it entirely, a confusion that a family like Evelyn's simply could not afford to risk, regardless of how unfair or how thoroughly unearned such a mistaken impression might be. This was one of the quieter, less discussed edges of the whole elaborate system, the way that respectability, for a woman, remained perpetually contingent on a kind of visible protection, whether a father's arm, a husband's name, or simply a private carriage waiting at the curb, that a man of identical social standing never needed to think about at all. None of this meant Evelyn experienced her own evenings as constrained or unhappy. Not really, not most of the time. She had never known anything different, had grown up entirely inside this particular set of rules, the way a fish grows up inside water, without any felt sense of the water itself as a limitation, only as the simple, unremarkable medium her whole life moved through. It was only in moments like this one, drowsy in the back of a warm carriage at the end of a long night, that the shape of the whole system became briefly, quietly visible to her, the enormous privilege of the evening she had just enjoyed sitting alongside the equally enormous, equally unremarkable set of restrictions that had shaped every hour of it. Two things that did not cancel each other out so much as simply coexist. the way heat and cold can sometimes both be felt at once through a single pane of glass. The rain earlier in the evening had been a small, mild example of the same underlying pattern. A sudden shower outside the theatre had meant, for most of the departing crowd, damp shoulders and hurried steps toward whatever transport they could find. For Evelyn, it had meant almost nothing beyond a few seconds beneath a held umbrella between one dry, warm space and the next. Weather, like so much else in this world, did not touch everyone equally, and the particular genius, if that was the right word for it, of a household like hers lay precisely in how thoroughly it had organized itself to keep discomfort of nearly every kind at the greatest possible distance from the people it was built to protect. There was, too, a broader question the evening had raised without ever stating it directly, one that Evelyn had heard discussed more than once among the older women of her circle, Mrs. Ashworth among them, in careful, measured tones over tea or in the quiet stretch of an afternoon call. What, exactly, could a respectable, wealthy woman do in public after dark, and what could she not do, and how much did the answer actually depend on age, on marital status, on which particular street, which particular hour? A married woman of established position, moving with her husband or within a settled social circle, enjoyed considerably more latitude than an unmarried woman of 27, still building her own reputation from the ground up. A widow, paradoxically, often enjoyed more freedom still, her marital chapter already closed, her position secure enough that a certain amount of independent movement raised remarkably few eyebrows. The rules, in other words, were never quite as fixed or as universal as an outsider glancing in from a different century might assume. They shifted, subtly, person by person, family by family, forming less a single wall than a kind of loose, uneven fence, higher in some places, almost absent in others, and every woman inside this world learned, gradually, exactly where the fence stood around her own particular life. There is a particular stretch of road, not far past the theatre district, where the carriage always seems to slow slightly regardless of traffic, an old habit of the coachman's that Evelyn has never asked about and has simply come to expect, and it is here, tonight, that she finds herself watching a single lamp lighter finish his rounds, moving from post to post along a quiet side street, with the long pole balanced easily in one hand, extinguishing nothing, since the hour for that will not come until well after dawn, but adjusting something at the base of one lamp that seems to have been giving him trouble, a small, ordinary piece of maintenance performed by a man whose entire working life Evelyn will never know anything more about than this one brief, unremarkable glimpse through a moving carriage window. The wet street holds the light differently now than it had earlier in the evening, less of the sharp, busy glitter that a crowd of carriages and pedestrians had thrown across it during the fashionable hour. More of a soft, steady shimmer, each lamp's reflection stretched long and wavering across the stone, undisturbed by traffic, a series of small golden ribbons laid down the length of an otherwise empty road. Evelyn watches them slide past the window, one after another, in a rhythm slow enough now that she can actually follow individual reflections from the moment they appear to the moment they finally slip away behind the carriage, something she never has the patience or the occasion to do during the earlier, busier hours of an evening like this one. Her father continues his silent watch out the opposite window, and Evelyn allows herself, in this small private pocket of the ride, to simply exist without needing to think about anything in particular, the specific luxury of an unoccupied mind that an evening this carefully managed rarely permits until its very final stretch. She thinks, briefly and without urgency, about how strange it is that a single evening can hold so many entirely different textures within it, the bright, structured formality of dinner, the layered social theatre of the theatre itself, the looser, warmer energy of the late supper, and now this, something closer to nothing at all, simply motion and lamplight and the steady, patient sound of hooves against wet stone. A church clock somewhere nearby strikes the half-hour, its sound arriving faintly through the carriage's closed window, softened by distance and by the general hush that has settled over this part of the city, and Evelyn finds herself, for a moment, trying to place exactly which half-hour it might be, gives up the effort almost immediately, and simply lets the sound pass through her the way she has been letting most things pass through her for the last several minutes, without needing to fix any of it firmly in place. The carriage crosses a small bridge over what she believes is one of the city's minor waterways, mostly hidden now beneath decades of building, its presence marked only by a faint dampness in the air and a slight change in the sound the wheels make against the road surface. And beyond it, the streets grow gradually more familiar, wider, quieter, lined with the particular kind of substantial, unhurried architecture that marks the approach to Mayfair from this direction. A few windows glow softly in the townhouses they pass, though most stand entirely dark now, their occupants long since retired, the whole district settling into the particular, complete stillness that only ever properly arrives in the deepest hours of the night, after even the latest suppers have finally ended and the last carriages have carried their passengers home. There is more of dinner that comes back to her now too, small fragments surfacing out of order the way memory does at this hour. There is more to notice in a room like this one than any single glance can take in, and Evelyn, over 2 seasons of practice, has become rather skilled at taking it in anyway, in small unhurried increments spread across an entire meal. The wine, for instance, arrives in its own careful sequence, a pale, crisp white poured to accompany the fish, replaced later by something deeper and more substantial for the mutton, each glass filled only part way, never to the brim, a small detail of service that Evelyn has never once questioned and has simply always known, the way she has always known which fork belongs to which course, without needing to count from the outside in. Her own glass is filled more sparingly than her father's, a quiet, unremarked upon convention that nobody at the table would think to comment on. Young unmarried women of her circle expected to take wine lightly, if at all, a single glass sipped slowly across the length of an entire dinner, rather than anything approaching what the gentlemen at nearby tables were visibly enjoying. Across the room, a party of 4 older gentlemen, their conversation loud enough to carry in fragments even over the general noise of the restaurant, appear to be discussing something political, a debate in the house that had apparently grown heated that same afternoon, their voices rising and falling with the particular energy of men who enjoy an argument nearly as much as they enjoy the meal accompanying it. Nearer the window, an elderly couple dine in a silence that seems entirely comfortable rather than strained, the kind of quiet that Evelyn imagines must come only after several decades of marriage, when conversation has stopped being necessary in quite the same urgent way it once was. A waiter passes with a large silver dish held aloft, something involving a great deal of flame briefly visible above it, a dessert prepared tableside 2 rooms away that draws a small ripple of attention from nearby tables as it goes by, several heads turning to watch, a few low comments exchanged about whose table it must be headed toward and what exactly the occasion might be. Evelyn catches her father's eye across their own table and sees the same small knowing amusement there that she feels herself, the shared silent acknowledgement that this particular flourish of theatre, quite literally staged for exactly this reaction, has worked precisely as intended. The room continues to fill even as they eat, later arrivals shown to remaining tables by the same deferential waiters, each new entrance accompanied by its own brief ripple of attention from the tables already seated, a quick practiced assessment performed by half the room simultaneously, who is arriving, with whom, wearing what, and what any of it might mean. Evelyn has learned to perform this same assessment herself without any conscious effort at all, her eyes moving over a newly arrived party in the same few seconds it takes to register colour, cut and company, filing the information away almost before she is aware of having gathered it. It occurs to her, watching all of this unfold across the course of a single meal, that a room like this one functions almost like its own small society in miniature, complete with its own hierarchy, its own currency, its own careful rules about who may speak to whom and under what circumstances, a condensed, intensified version of the larger world she moves through every day of the season, all of it happening simultaneously across perhaps 30 separate tables, each one its own small drama of status and appearance and careful self-presentation, and all of it, remarkably, proceeding under the shared unspoken fiction that everyone present is simply here to enjoy a pleasant dinner. There had been, too, a small moment just after they were first seated at dinner, easy to overlook amid everything else the evening held, when a young waiter, newer to the room than his more practiced colleagues, had hesitated slightly over which side to serve the soup from, a tiny, almost invisible pause, that only someone watching as closely as Evelyn happened to be watching would have noticed at all. An older waiter had corrected him with nothing more than a brief, quiet word and a small gesture, and the moment had passed so smoothly that her parents had not registered it in the slightest. Evelyn had found herself, oddly, rather charmed by it, a small crack in the room's otherwise seamless performance of effortless service, a reminder that behind every flawless evening sat real people, learning, adjusting, managing their own small anxieties just out of sight of the diners they served. She thinks of this now, turning it over one final time in the last soft minutes before sleep, and finds it a fitting enough note to end on. The whole evening, for all its careful polish, built finally from countless small human efforts, hers included, each of them imperfect somewhere beneath the surface, each of them, in the end, entirely enough. The sweet course arrives eventually, after the mutton has been cleared, and the table brushed clean of crumbs by a waiter who performs the small task so unobtrusively that Evelyn barely notices him doing it. Tonight it is a light almond cream, moulded into a delicate shape, and served with a compote of poached pears that had, the waiter explains when her father asks, been sent up from the kitchen's own private supplier in Kent, a small detail offered with just enough quiet pride that Evelyn understands it is meant to be appreciated rather than simply informed. She eats slowly, savouring the particular coolness of the cream against a palate that has spent the last hour working through soup and fish and roasted meat, and finds herself, not for the first time this evening, faintly amused by the sheer scale of the whole undertaking, course after course after course, each one a small performance of its own, arriving and departing with a formality that would strike an outsider, she suspects, as almost comically elaborate for what is, underneath all the ceremony, simply dinner. Coffee comes last, poured into cups so small and so delicate that Evelyn has always found them faintly absurd, barely 2 proper swallows apiece, and yet somehow exactly right for the moment they arrive in, a signal more than a beverage, the final soft punctuation mark at the close of a long meal. Her father takes his black, and Evelyn herself has never quite decided which she prefers, alternating between black and a small measure of cream depending on nothing more than whatever mood happens to strike her in the particular moment the cup is set down in front of her. It is somewhere in this last quiet stretch of the meal, coffee cooling slowly in its tiny cup, conversation drifting toward nothing in particular, that the evening's earlier formality finally begins to loosen just slightly, her father leaning back in his chair with the satisfied air of a man who has eaten well, his own attention wandering pleasantly across the room, rather than staying fixed on any single point of etiquette that might need managing. This, Evelyn has come to understand, is the actual shape of a proper dinner in rooms exactly like this one, not a single sustained performance from first course to last, but a performance that builds carefully through its early stages and is finally, gently, allowed to soften once its most important work has been done. Her father had spent much of dinner's earlier stretch discussing, in the low, unhurried tones he reserved for exactly this kind of conversation, some matter of business with a colleague who had stopped briefly at their table before dinner properly began, something involving a shipping concern he held shares in, a venture that had apparently performed rather well over the past quarter, and Evelyn had listened with the particular half-attention she gave most conversations about money and business, understanding the general shape of it without troubling herself over the specifics, since the specifics were, in the ordinary course of her life, simply not information she was expected to need. This too was part of the architecture that made an evening like tonight's possible at all, an entire invisible structure of investments and shares and careful financial management that her father attended to daily, and that she experienced only as its comfortable, effortless result, a private carriage waiting outside a townhouse, a wardrobe of 15 or 20 evening gowns kept in steady rotation, a family account that could absorb, without any visible strain, the cost of a fashionable dinner, a box at the theatre, and a late supper afterward, all in a single evening, without anyone at the table needing to so much as glance at a bill. Her elder brother James was not present tonight, currently travelling on the continent with 2 university friends on the kind of extended, loosely educational tour that young men of his standing often undertook in the years between finishing their formal studies and settling properly into whatever occupation, or in James's case, whatever eventual management of the family's own affairs, awaited them. Evelyn missed him more than she generally admitted, missed particularly his habit of teasing her gently about exactly the kind of careful social manoeuvring she had spent this entire evening performing. A teasing that had always managed to feel affectionate rather than unkind, a reminder from someone who loved her that the whole elaborate system, for all its genuine importance, was also, in its own way, rather a lot of fuss over what were, underneath everything, simply people trying to find their way toward each other. She thought she might write to him tomorrow, a proper letter rather than the brief notes they usually exchanged, describing the evening in enough detail that he could picture it clearly from wherever on the continent he currently found himself, the oysters, the rain outside the theatre, and perhaps, if she found herself in the right mood by the time she actually sat down with pen and paper, a brief, carefully casual mention of a Mr. Hartley, offered in exactly the tone that revealed nothing, and yet, to a brother who knew her as well as James did, would almost surely reveal everything. Her father's business conversation from earlier in the evening drifts back to her too. Fragments of it anyway. Something about a shipping venture performing well this quarter. Numbers she had absorbed without really absorbing. The way she absorbed most conversations about money, understanding their general shape without troubling herself over the specifics. It struck her now, in this loose, unhurried final review, how strange it was that an entire evening of such visible luxury rested on foundations she understood so poorly, ledgers and shares and careful investments managed by men in offices she has never once visited, translating themselves eventually into silk and pearls and a private carriage waiting outside a restaurant, the whole elaborate chain of cause and effect entirely invisible to her despite being, in the most literal sense, the thing that made her entire evening possible. The season this particular autumn had been unusually mild so far, mild enough that her father had commented on it more than once over the preceding weeks, a gentleness in the weather that had allowed evening wraps to remain relatively light and had spared the family carriage's window glass the thick, persistent condensation that a proper London cold snap usually produced by this point in the year. Evelyn remembered other autumns considerably harsher than this one, evenings when the walk from front door to carriage had required considerably heavier furs, when the horse's breath had hung visibly in air cold enough to sting, when a carriage ride home from an evening exactly like tonight's had meant huddling gratefully beneath a heavy carriage rug, rather than simply enjoying the mild, faintly damp air drifting in through a window cracked slightly for freshness. Winter proper would arrive soon enough, bringing with it its own particular rhythm to the season's remaining evenings. Fires built higher throughout the house, hot bricks wrapped in flannel tucked beneath carriage seats for even the shortest journeys, the family's heavier furs brought out from storage and aired properly before their first use. London in deep winter held a different character after dark than London in this gentler, transitional stretch of early autumn, the same gas lamps burning against a colder, sharper darkness, the same fashionable streets, somehow feeling both cozier and more urgent, everyone hurrying slightly more briskly between the warm interiors of restaurants and theatres and their own waiting carriages. Summer, when it eventually returned after the season itself had properly ended and most families like Evelyn's decamped to their country estates or to the coast, brought its own considerable relief. The city's evening air finally freed from winter's damp chill, though summer heat in London carried its own particular discomforts. Closer, staler air trapped between tall buildings, gowns chosen in lighter fabrics specifically to manage an evening that might otherwise feel oppressively warm inside a crowded candlelit dining room. Evelyn had spent enough seasons now moving through this same yearly cycle to recognize each stage of it almost by instinct, the particular quality of light, the particular weight of fabric appropriate to each stretch of the calendar, an entire embodied knowledge she had absorbed so gradually over so many years that she could no longer clearly remember a time before she possessed it. Tonight at least, the mild weather had been simply, quietly convenient, a kind gift from a season that could easily have made the evening considerably less comfortable than it turned out to be, and Evelyn, drifting now toward the last stretch of her thoughts before sleep finally claims her fully, feels a small, unremarkable gratitude for it, the same kind of gratitude she feels for so much else about her carefully arranged existence, rarely examined directly and yet steadily, reliably present beneath almost everything she does. Mayfair itself, the particular small district that has contained the whole of Evelyn's domestic life since birth, carries its own quiet weight within London's larger geography, a compact grid of streets and squares laid out more than a century earlier and maintained, ever since, as one of the city's most consistently fashionable addresses, its tall uniform terraces of white stucco and pale brick presenting an unbroken face of respectability to anyone walking or riding through. To live here, as Evelyn's family has for 3 generations now, communicated something specific and immediate to anyone who understood London's internal geography well enough to read it. A settled, established position among the city's wealthier families, distinct from the newer fortunes clustering in some of the city's more recently developed districts, distinct too from the old aristocratic grandeur of certain other neighbourhoods whose great houses belonged to families whose titles stretched back centuries further than anything Evelyn's own family could claim. Her family's money, as her father had once explained to her with a frankness Evelyn suspected was not universal among fathers of her circle, had been made 2 generations back, her great-grandfather having built a considerable fortune in trade before the family gradually smoothed its rougher commercial edges through several careful generations of marriage, education, and precisely calibrated social climbing until it arrived, by the time of Evelyn's own birth, at exactly this comfortable established position, wealthy enough to move confidently through the same rooms as families whose money stretched back centuries further, and yet still, in certain quiet, rarely acknowledged ways, understood by the oldest families to be relative newcomers, however many generations had actually passed. This was, Evelyn had come to understand, simply one more layer in the intricate, largely unspoken hierarchy that governed everything from where a family's carriage could reasonably park outside a ball to how quickly an invitation from a particular hostess might arrive, a hierarchy considerably less rigid than it had been in her grandmother's day, when new money and old money had maintained a more visible, more carefully guarded distance from one another, and considerably more rigid still than it would likely become by the time Evelyn's own eventual daughters, should she have any, came of age themselves. The whole system, in other words, was in constant slow motion, boundaries shifting gradually with each passing decade, families rising and occasionally falling, the specific shape of who belonged where, never quite as fixed as any single evening's careful etiquette might suggest. Evelyn's own address, this particular quiet street of tall white houses, sat comfortably enough within all of this that she rarely had cause to think about it directly, the way a person rarely thinks directly about the specific chemistry of the air they breathe, and it was only in moments exactly like this one, drifting towards sleep at the end of a long, carefully calibrated evening, that the whole intricate structure surfaced briefly into conscious thought before dissolving again into the simpler, more immediate comfort of a warm bed in a quiet house on a street that had, for 3 generations now, quietly and reliably belonged to people exactly like her family. The footman who let them out 3.5 hours ago is the one who opens the door now, having waited up, as footmen in households like this one always did, for the family's return, however late that return might come. He takes her father's coat first, and Evelyn hands over her own velvet cloak second, feeling, as she always does at this exact moment, the strange small shift of stepping from the version of herself the evening required into something closer to the version that only this house, this family, ever sees. Somewhere behind the house, in the mews, the coachman has already led the horses in, unharnessing them by lantern light, settling them for whatever remains of the night. The mews holds its own separate rhythm entirely disconnected from anything happening inside the main house, the coachman's small rooms above the stable dark now within the half hour, an entire second household existing in miniature just a few dozen feet from the front door, its own comings and goings, its own quiet routines, almost entirely invisible to the family it serves, despite being, in the most practical sense, the thing that made every single outing of the whole evening possible in the first place. The hallway is dim, lit by a single lamp turned low, and the house holds the particular hush of a home that has been asleep, or nearly asleep, for hours, a quiet so complete after the noise of the evening that it takes Evelyn a moment to adjust to it, the way eyes take a moment to adjust after stepping from bright light into darkness. Somewhere upstairs, faintly, a clock strikes the half-hour, though she could not immediately say which half-hour, her sense of time having gone slightly soft and unreliable in the way it does at the end of a very long evening. Her father says good night in the hallway, a brief, affectionate exchange, already half occupied with tomorrow's schedule as he heads toward his own rooms. Evelyn climbs the stairs alone, her gloved hand trailing the banister the way it did on the way down hours earlier, though everything about the gesture feels different now, slower, heavier, the accumulated weight of the evening finally settling fully into her shoulders now that there is nobody left to perform composure for. There is a particular way the whole house seems to breathe differently once the family has finally returned and settled, a shift Evelyn has noticed since childhood without ever quite naming it, the accumulated tension of an empty house waiting for its people finally releasing itself the moment the front door closes for the last time that night. She remembers, as a small girl, being allowed to wait up occasionally for her parents' return from some grand evening exactly like tonight's, tucked into a window seat with a nursery maid dozing beside her, watching for the particular pattern of carriage lamps that meant her own family's carriage rather than someone else's turning onto their quiet street, and she wonders, briefly, whether some similar version of that same small ritual might await her own children one day, decades from now, in this same house, or one very much like it. Sarah is waiting in her bedroom, as she always is, however late the hour, having likely dozed in the chair near the window rather than gone properly to sleep herself, a small kindness that Evelyn has never once thanked her for directly, and has always, quietly, appreciated more than she knows how to say. A single lamp burns on the dressing table, its light low and warm, and the fire in the small grate has been kept alive, banked down to a slow, steady glow rather than a full blaze, exactly enough to keep the room's chill at bay without wasting coal through the empty hours while the family was out. The undressing, when it begins, moves in something close to reverse order from the dressing that happened hours earlier, though it never quite mirrors it exactly, the way unwinding a long day never quite retraces the exact path that built it. Sarah starts with the gloves, easing them from Evelyn's fingers one at a time, the fine kid leather slightly warm now from hours worn against her skin, folding each glove with the same careful attention she gave them at the start of the evening, checking, out of habit, for any small tear or stain that might need mending before they are worn again. The pearls come next, the clasp at the back of Evelyn's neck fumbled slightly by fingers that have grown tired over the course of the day, and Sarah sets them into a small velvet-lined box on the dressing table, followed by the earrings, followed by the gold bracelet, each piece placed with a specific practiced care that treats jewellery worth more than most households earn in a year, with the same unhurried attention Sarah might give to anything else that simply needs putting away properly. It occurs to Evelyn, watching the pearls settle into their velvet box, that she had worn almost nothing else tonight, jewellery-wise, and that the choice had never actually been hers to begin with. A young unmarried woman of her age was expected to wear jewellery sparingly, a single strand, a small pair of earrings, restraint itself functioning as its own quiet form of display. Too much glitter on a girl of 27 read as reaching above her station, while the same sapphires and diamonds worn by a married woman of 35 in her own settled position would draw no comment at all. She had chosen these particular pieces herself from her own jewellery box an hour before they left the house, a habit of quiet, practised restraint she had learnt so thoroughly over the years that it no longer required any real thought at all. Evelyn had in fact worn this particular pearl necklace once before, under considerably less comfortable circumstances, a formal family portrait sitting 2 winters earlier that had required her to hold an entirely unnatural pose for what felt like an hour while a photographer fussed with lighting and plates behind a large wooden camera, and she remembers thinking, at the time, that the pearls had felt heavier that day than they had any right to, though she now understands the weight had probably belonged less to the jewellery itself and more to the sheer boredom of holding perfectly still for so unreasonably long a stretch of a single afternoon. The gloves, folded now and set aside for tomorrow's mending should any seam need it, had done their own quiet work all evening, worn through dinner and removed only at the table itself, a small ritual every woman in her circle performed identically, and that would look, to eyes outside this particular world, almost comically formal for something as simple as eating, and the gown itself, cut low across shoulders that would have scandalized her own grandmother, had said something all evening that daytime dress never said at all. A morning gown covered her throat, her wrists, often her collarbone, practical for calling on friends or walking in the park. Evening dress did nearly the opposite of everything, and the bareness was never immodesty so much as a kind of code, readable only by people fluent enough in it to read it correctly, saying, among other things, that this was a woman whose family had nothing to hide and everything worth displaying. And here Evelyn feels something she has felt before, on countless nights just like this one, though she has never quite found the words for it, and does not try to find them now either. There is a particular relief, almost physical, in the removal of jewellery at the end of a long evening, the small weight of it lifted from ears and wrist and throat, as though some accumulated tension she had not fully noticed carrying has been quietly set down along with the pearls themselves. The gown takes longer, dozens of tiny hooks running the length of her spine, each one requiring the same patient precision it required to fasten hours earlier, only now performed by hands that are tired and eyes that are, if Evelyn is honest, slightly bloodshot from a long evening of candlelight and gas lamps. Sarah works methodically, hook by hook, and as the bodice loosens, Evelyn feels her breath deepen almost involuntarily, the boning that held her upright and composed through dinner and theatre and supper, finally releasing its grip, her body settling back into a posture that feels, after so many hours of careful uprightness, almost unfamiliar. The gown itself, once fully unhooked, is lifted carefully away and laid across a chair near the wardrobe, not yet put away properly, that task saved for the following morning, when there is better light and more patience for the delicate work of brushing out the day's dust and checking the hem for any damage picked up during a long evening's travel across London's damp streets. Beneath it, Evelyn stands in her underclothes, the layers that nobody outside this room, outside this exact small circle of family and servant, ever sees. The corset still laced firm around her ribs, the chemise beneath it slightly damp with the accumulated warmth of an evening spent in overheated rooms. The corset comes off next, Sarah's fingers working quickly at the laces down the back, loosening them enough to ease the whole garment away. And this, more than the gown, more than the jewellery, is the moment when Evelyn's body seems to fully exhale, the accumulated pressure of an entire evening's posture finally, completely released. She takes a full breath, deeper than any breath she has taken since roughly 6 o'clock that evening, and feels her ribs expand in a way they simply could not while laced, a sensation so specific and so familiar that she barely registers it as remarkable anymore. Though if she stopped to think about it, she might wonder how strange it is that such an ordinary, nightly relief could still feel, every single time, quietly wonderful. Sarah has already prepared the washstand, a jug of warm water carried up some 20 minutes earlier and kept covered near the fire to hold its heat, and Evelyn crosses to it now, wrapped in a light dressing gown, while the rest of the day's clothing is gathered and set aside. The water, poured into the wide china basin, is warm rather than hot, exactly the temperature that feels, at the end of a long evening, less like washing and more like a kind of quiet comfort administered directly to tired skin. A soft cloth, a bar of scented soap milled somewhere in France, and smelling faintly of lavender and something harder to name underneath it, and Evelyn washes her face and neck and hands with slow, unhurried strokes, feeling the last traces of the evening, the faint smoke from the theatre's chandeliers, the salt from the oysters, the general accumulated grime of several hours moving through a busy city, lift gently away. There is something almost ceremonial about this small, private ritual, performed identically most nights of her life regardless of what the day contained, whether she has spent it visiting a dying great-aunt, or dancing until midnight at the largest ball of the season. The warm water, the soft cloth, the particular quiet of a bedroom at the end of a long day, lit now only by firelight and a single lamp rather than the blazing chandeliers of a few hours earlier. It is in its own modest way one of the most reliable comforts in Evelyn's entire life, more reliable, in fact, than almost anything that happened during the evening itself, since the evening depended on so many other people, so many other choices, so much careful management of appearance and conversation, while this small ritual depends on nothing at all except warm water and a closed door. Her hair comes down next, Sarah working through the pins one at a time, each small metal piece dropped into a shallow dish on the dressing table with a soft individual click until finally the elaborate arrangement that took the better part of 40 minutes to construct earlier in the evening falls loose across Evelyn's shoulders in a single long, slightly waved mass. Sarah brushes it out with long, even strokes, 100 strokes by old custom, though nobody in this house has ever actually counted, working from the crown down to the ends, and Evelyn closes her eyes and lets the rhythmic motion of the brush do what it always does at this hour, easing something tight and wound up in her chest that no amount of conversation earlier in the evening had quite managed to loosen. That elaborate arrangement had taken Sarah the better part of 40 minutes to build earlier in the evening, hair drawn up and back over a small padded frame, to give it height and shape. Curled at the front with heated tongs, Sarah kept warming by the fire while she worked, pinned in place with what felt, at the time, like an entire box of hairpins, though the shallow dish now on the dressing table holds, once counted, considerably fewer than Evelyn would have guessed. A single diamond ornament had been set near the crown, catching candlelight whenever she turned her head, chosen specifically to draw the eye upward rather than toward the low neckline of the gown. A small deliberate piece of visual management that Evelyn had never once had explained to her directly and had simply absorbed, the way she absorbed most of this, through years of watching the women in her family dress for evenings exactly like this one. The night dress, when it is finally brought out, is plain white cotton, high-necked and long-sleeved, trimmed with a narrow edge of lace at the collar and cuffs. Nothing at all like the elaborate silk that has spent the last several hours draped across her body in a dining room and a theatre box. There is something almost startling in the contrast, moving from a gown cut low across the shoulders, boned and structured and built entirely for other people's eyes, to a simple garment built for exactly one purpose: warmth through a cold London night, seen by nobody but herself and, for these final few minutes, the maid helping her into it. Over the nightdress goes a dressing gown, quilted and warm, and on her feet slippers lined with soft wool. And by the time Sarah has finished, perhaps 25 minutes have passed since they first entered the room, the elaborate architecture of the evening's appearance dismantled piece by piece and replaced with something considerably simpler, considerably more honest, in the sense that nothing about it is performing for anyone. The bedroom itself, now that Evelyn has a moment to actually notice it rather than simply moving through it, holds its own particular late-night character. The fire in the small grate glows low and steady, casting shifting orange light across the ceiling and across the pale wallpaper, a pattern of small flowers that Evelyn chose herself 2 years earlier and has never once regretted, though she could not now say precisely why she chose that particular pattern over the half-dozen others the paperhanger brought to show her. Heavy curtains, drawn fully closed against the night, muffle whatever remains of London's late traffic to almost nothing, a distant, occasional rumble of wheels on stone that reaches the room only as the faintest suggestion of sound rather than anything that could actually disturb sleep. A small table beside the bed holds a lamp turned low, a glass of water that Sarah refilled sometime during the family's absence, and a book that Evelyn has been reading for the better part of 2 weeks, a novel borrowed from a circulating library that half of fashionable London seems to be reading this particular season, its spine now creased at roughly the 2/3 mark where she left off 3 nights ago. She may read a page or two before sleep, or she may not, depending on how quickly her eyes grow heavy, a decision she rarely makes consciously, and that the evening itself, exhausting in its own quiet way, has probably already made for her. The bed, when Sarah pulls back the covers, has been warmed already with a stone-hot water bottle wrapped in flannel, tucked between the sheets an hour or more ago, and now radiating a gentle, even heat across the lower half of the mattress, a small luxury so consistent in this household that Evelyn genuinely cannot remember the last time she climbed into a cold bed, and would find the experience, if it ever happened, almost shocking in its unfamiliarity. The sheets themselves are fine linen, laundered and pressed by hands Evelyn has never met and will never think to ask about, smooth and slightly cool at first touch, before the trapped warmth from the hot water bottle spreads gradually up to meet her. Blankets, several of them, layered for exactly the kind of autumn chill that has settled over London this particular week, and above them a quilted counterpane in a soft rose colour that matches, more or less by coincidence, the wine-coloured gown now hanging, brushed and aired, in the wardrobe across the room. The hot water bottle itself, wrapped carefully in its flannel cover, had been a small point of household pride ever since Evelyn first introduced the practice into their evening routine some years earlier, a habit she had picked up from a friend's household and insisted upon ever since, with a consistency that the rest of the household had simply come to expect. Other households she had visited over the years managed the same task with warming pans instead, heated coals carried carefully between the sheets on a long-handled brass pan, and withdrawn before anyone actually climbed into bed, a method Evelyn had always found slightly alarming in principle, even if she had never once heard of it going wrong in practice. Somewhere in the quiet stretch of hallway Evelyn passed through twice tonight, once descending toward the carriage, and once climbing back up toward bed, hang the same portraits that have hung there her entire life, relatives she knows mostly through inherited stories rather than memory, a great-grandfather whose stern painted expression had frightened her as a small child, and now strikes her, 27 years old, as faintly amusing rather than intimidating, an aunt who died young, and whose painted likeness Evelyn herself sometimes pauses before, without quite knowing why, some quiet, inherited fondness for a relative she never actually met. Evelyn had not paused before any of them tonight, moving too quickly, too focused on the evening ahead, and, later, too tired from the evening behind her, but she thinks of them now, briefly, this quiet, watching gallery of family faces that has witnessed every one of her own comings and goings across 27 years without ever once changing expression, and finds something oddly comforting in their fixed, unchanging presence, generation after generation of the same family passing beneath their painted gaze, each one, in turn, dressing for an evening, returning from it, and eventually becoming, themselves, simply another quiet face on that same hallway wall for some future descendant to pass without quite pausing to look. Lying now in the loosened comfort of her nightdress, Evelyn finds herself thinking, briefly, about the particular physical experience of an evening spent in evening dress, a subject she rarely considers directly despite living inside its consequences several nights a week throughout the season. The corset itself, laced snugly rather than severely, had shaped her posture through the entire evening in ways she had stopped consciously noticing sometime around age 17. The straight back, the particular economy of movement it encouraged, bending from the hip rather than the waist, turning the whole body rather than twisting at the middle, small adjustments so thoroughly absorbed into her ordinary way of moving that she genuinely could not say, if asked, how much of tonight's composed, graceful bearing belonged to careful training and how much belonged simply to the garment itself, doing quietly, mechanically, what years of practice had also taught her body to do on its own. There were women in her circle who laced considerably tighter than she ever had, chasing a silhouette that Evelyn herself had always considered faintly excessive, and Evelyn had watched, on more than one occasion, a friend grow visibly pale partway through a long evening, required to step briefly into some quiet anteroom to catch her breath before returning, composed again, to whatever ballroom or dining room the evening required. Evelyn herself had never gone to quite that extreme, having settled early on, through nothing more than her own good sense, into the conviction that a gown ought to fit its wearer rather than the other way around, and she was, lying here now in the loose, unlaced comfort of her nightdress, quietly grateful for that particular piece of practical wisdom, even if she had occasionally, at 16 or 17, resented it as old-fashioned caution rather than the good judgment it had actually turned out to be. The shoes, too, had done their own quiet work across the evening. Delicate things, silk-covered and heeled just enough to lengthen her stride into something more elegant than practical, entirely unsuited to any real distance, and entirely suited to the short, careful movements an evening like tonight's actually required, from carriage to restaurant door, from restaurant table to theatre box, a wardrobe of movement calibrated as precisely as the wardrobe of clothing itself. Her feet, freed now from those same shoes, and tucked instead into warm wool slippers, carry their own small ache, not sharp, simply the accumulated tiredness of several hours spent standing and walking in shoes built for appearance considerably more than for comfort, and she flexes her toes slightly beneath the blankets, enjoying, in a small private way, the particular relief of exactly this. There was a particular choreography to arriving anywhere fashionable in London after dark that Evelyn had performed so many times across 2 full seasons that she no longer consciously registered its individual steps, though she found herself in this loose, reflective stretch before sleep, walking back through it deliberately, the way a dancer might mentally rehearse a familiar sequence of steps without actually moving her feet. The carriage slowing, the door opening from the outside rather than within, always managed by someone else, a footman or a doorman stationed exactly for this purpose, a gloved hand extended to help her down, not because the step itself was particularly difficult to manage, but because an elaborate evening gown, weighted with silk and trained slightly at the back, made an unassisted descent considerably less graceful than the assisted version, and grace, on an evening like this one, mattered in a way that practical ease simply did not. A brief pause on the pavement, gathering her skirts with one hand while the other remained lightly on whichever arm was offered, her father's most often, sometimes a footman's, and then the short, careful walk toward whatever glowing entrance awaited, an umbrella held overhead if the sky required it, a doorman already pulling the door wide before she had fully arrived, so that the transition from cold outer air to warm interior happened in a single unbroken motion rather than any awkward pause at a closed door. Every doorman she had encountered tonight, at the restaurant, at the theatre, at the late supper room, had performed this same small ritual with a kind of practiced invisibility that Evelyn had come to appreciate more the more she thought about it, present exactly when needed, and otherwise entirely unobtrusive, their own long evenings spent standing in exactly the kind of cold, damp air that Evelyn herself had experienced only in the briefest possible doses between one warm room and the next. She wondered, briefly, what those same evenings looked like from the other side of that particular exchange, standing for hours in evening dress considerably plainer than her own, holding an umbrella over strangers who rarely looked at their faces long enough to remember them the following day. It was not a thought she pursued very far tonight, tired as she was, but it arrived anyway, brief and quiet, one more small fragment among the many that had drifted through her mind across this long, eventful evening. She thinks briefly of the menu's careful French, sole-prepared one particular way, a sauce named for some long-dead chef or aristocrat, whose original recipe had likely been altered considerably by the time it reached tonight's kitchen, and of how strange it had always seemed to her that a plate of fish, however skillfully prepared, required an entire foreign vocabulary to properly announce itself in a room full of people who mostly spoke English at every other point in their day. Her governess, years earlier, had insisted on exactly enough French for precisely this purpose: menus, occasional phrases dropped into fashionable conversation, nothing approaching real fluency, simply enough polish to move comfortably through rooms where such polish was expected, and its absence would have been quietly, unkindly noticed. The whole evening, turned over now in this loose, unhurried final review, had been built from dozens of such small, specific competencies, knowing which fork to use without needing to watch anyone else first, knowing how long a glance could reasonably linger before it became something worth commenting on, knowing exactly how to decline a second glass of champagne without seeming either prudish or rude, an entire invisible curriculum that nobody had ever handed her as a formal lesson, and that she had nonetheless absorbed so completely over 27 years of careful observation that she could not now separate it from anything she might call her own natural instinct. Perhaps that was simply what growing up inside a world like this one actually meant, she thinks, drifting now toward the very last edge of waking thought. Not a set of rules memorized and consciously applied, but something closer to a second nature, so thoroughly absorbed that an entire evening of careful, constant performance could feel, from the inside, remarkably close to simply being herself. The calling card system itself, which Evelyn had grown up understanding so thoroughly that she rarely stopped to consider how strange it might look to an outsider, functioned through an entire quiet vocabulary of small physical gestures that most people in her circle absorbed gradually through years of observation, rather than any single lesson ever explicitly taught. A card left in person, handed directly to a servant at the door, carried different weight than a card simply sent round by messenger. A folded corner on a particular side of the card could indicate that the caller had come to offer condolences rather than an ordinary social visit, a convention that varied slightly from household to household, but that most families within a given social circle understood well enough to read correctly. Leaving a card without asking to be received at all, simply depositing it and departing, functioned as its own distinct social gesture, a way of acknowledging an acquaintance or marking a special occasion, a birth, an engagement, a return from an extended absence abroad, without requiring the fuller commitment of an actual visit. A young woman like Evelyn did not, as a rule, call anywhere entirely alone. Her own calls typically made in the company of an older female relative or a trusted family friend, the two of them working through a carefully maintained list of acquaintances who required visiting during whichever afternoon hours the household had designated for exactly this purpose, hours printed, in the more formal households, directly beneath the family's address on their own calling cards, an open standing invitation that nonetheless required a certain fluency to manage correctly, since arriving on the wrong day, or staying beyond the appropriate quarter hour, or failing to return a call within a reasonable window afterward, could each register, in their own small way, as a minor breach of the system's careful etiquette. Should Mr. Hartley's mother eventually call at Evelyn's own home, an event that Evelyn allowed herself, in these last drowsy minutes before sleep, to consider as a genuine, if far from certain, possibility, the visit itself would likely unfold across perhaps 20 careful minutes of conversation, covering nothing more consequential on its surface than the weather, a mutual acquaintance, perhaps some detail of the previous evening's theatre performance, and yet everyone involved, Evelyn's father very much included, would understand precisely what such a visit actually represented. A deliberate signal extended through exactly the correct formal channel that the Hartley family considered the acquaintance worth continuing, worth building carefully over the coming weeks into whatever it might eventually become. Sarah banks the fire down a final degree, checks the lamp's low flame, and asks, as she does every night, whether there is anything else Evelyn needs before she goes. There never is, not really, beyond perhaps a second blanket in the depths of winter, or a window cracked open in the height of summer, and tonight, this particular autumn night, Evelyn simply shakes her head and thanks her, genuinely, in the quiet, unremarkable way that has passed between them 1,000 times before, and will pass between them 1,000 times again. Sarah herself will not sleep for a while yet, Evelyn knows, some quiet part of the household routine that she has never asked about directly, but has pieced together over the years regardless, a final check of the fire, the folding away of tonight's gloves and stockings for the laundry, perhaps a cup of something warm taken alone in the kitchen, before she finally climbs the narrower stairs to her own small room on the floor above. Evelyn had asked her once, years earlier, whether she minded the late hours, and Sarah had simply shrugged and said that every household kept its own rhythm, and that she had long since stopped noticing this one as anything other than perfectly ordinary, an answer that had satisfied Evelyn at the time, and that she still, turning it over now, finds herself unable to fully imagine from the other side of it. The door closes with a soft click, and for the first time since roughly 6 o'clock that evening, Evelyn is entirely alone. It is a strange kind of aloneness, one she has never quite gotten used to noticing even after 27 years of living inside it. This specific transition from a day spent almost constantly observed, by family, by servants, by the entire watching architecture of London society, to a night spent in a room where, for a handful of hours at least, nobody is watching anything at all. She climbs into the warmed bed, feels the last of the evening's tension finally loosen from her shoulders against the pillow, and lies for a moment, simply looking at the low, shifting light the dying fire throws across the ceiling. This particular evening had been one small thread in something considerably larger, a pattern that repeated itself, with variations, several nights a week for roughly 4 months of every year. The London season, as it was known throughout fashionable society, ran broadly from spring through the middle of summer, a concentrated stretch of the calendar during which Parliament sat. The weather cooperated reasonably well, and families like Evelyn's who owned country estates elsewhere chose instead to occupy their London townhouses and throw themselves into precisely the kind of evening she has just returned from. Dinner after dinner, ball after ball, an accumulated, exhausting, glittering machinery whose underlying purpose, however much fun individual evenings might genuinely be, was fundamentally about exactly what tonight had turned out to involve: the careful, gradual introduction of eligible young men and women to one another under conditions controlled enough that families could feel reasonably confident nothing improper would occur along the way. A young woman's first season, when she was formally presented, traditionally involved being brought before the Queen at court, a single, enormously anticipated ceremony that Evelyn herself had undergone 2 years earlier, an experience she remembers now mostly as an overwhelming blur of nerves, an uncomfortable feathered headdress, and a curtsy she had practiced perhaps 200 times in the weeks beforehand until her knees ached from it. That presentation, brief as the actual moment at court had been, functioned as a kind of formal announcement to society at large, a signal that she was now, officially, available to be courted, introduced, considered. Tonight had not been her first season, not by 2 years, and there was a particular quality to being slightly past that first blush of newness that Evelyn had noticed settling over her only gradually, a comfort in knowing the rules well enough now to move through them almost without thinking, paired with a faint, rarely acknowledged awareness that time in a season like this one moved differently for a young woman than it did for a young man. A gentleman of 25 had years ahead of him to consider marriage at his leisure. A woman of 25, in Evelyn's particular social world, had already begun to feel, whether or not anyone said so directly, the season's clock ticking somewhat more insistently than it had ticked at 20. She does not dwell on this thought long tonight. It arrives as it sometimes does at the end of a long evening, and then it drifts away again, replaced by something warmer, the memory of a small round table near the centre of a candlelit supper room, a nod exchanged across 20 feet of space, a name that had, until this evening, existed for her only as a face half remembered from a ball earlier in the season, and now existed as considerably more than that. Tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, there might be a note, not from Mr. Hartley directly, that would be premature, almost improper this early, but perhaps a mention passed through Mrs. Ashworth, some small confirmation that the introduction had been noticed, had mattered, had planted whatever small seed such introductions were meant to plant, or perhaps nothing at all would come of it, and the evening would settle quietly into memory alongside a dozen other pleasant evenings that had in the end led nowhere in particular. Evelyn has learnt, over 2 seasons of practice, not to invest too heavily in any single evening's small, hopeful signals, since the machinery of courtship in her world moved slowly enough that a single promising conversation meant considerably less, statistically speaking, than an anxious 27-year-old might wish it to mean. Still, there had been something in the way he listened to her observation about the leading actress. There had been something in the particular attention of his beau near the supper-room door. Small things, both of them, the kind of small things that could mean everything or could mean nothing at all. And there was, Evelyn thinks, drifting now toward the particular loose, unfocused thinking that arrives just before sleep, a strange kind of pleasure in simply not knowing yet which it would turn out to be. Outside, beyond the heavy curtains, London continues its slow, gradual settling toward the deepest hours of the night. The last hansom cabs of the evening make their final runs, carrying home the stragglers from suppers and clubs that stayed open later than most. A milk cart, hours from its actual morning rounds, sits already loaded and waiting in some mews not far from here, its horse dozing standing up the way horses do, unbothered by the hour. Somewhere across the city, a night watchman checks a row of locked shop doors for the 3rd time this shift, finding them, as always, exactly as he left them. The gas lamps continue burning steadily down every street, keeping their patient vigil over pavements that, for these few hours at least, almost nobody walks. None of this reaches Evelyn's bedroom directly. The heavy curtains, the thick walls of a well-built Mayfair townhouse, the sheer physical distance between her warm, quiet room and the working, waking machinery of the city beyond it, all of it combines to create the particular hush that has settled over this house every night of Evelyn's entire life, a hush so complete and so familiar that she barely registers it as anything at all, the way a person stops noticing the sound of their own breathing. Her eyes, heavier now than they were even a few minutes ago, drift toward the book on the bedside table, and she considers briefly reading a page or two, finding out what happens next in the chapter she left unfinished 3 nights earlier. But the thought arrives and dissolves almost simultaneously, replaced by the simpler, more immediate pull of the warm bed beneath her, the low, steady glow of the dying fire, the particular boneless heaviness that an evening like tonight's, for all its glamour, for all its careful performance, eventually produces in even the most composed young woman. There is another thought that drifts through the last stretch of Evelyn's waking mind tonight, unhurried, the way thoughts move at this particular hour, about the gown itself, now hanging across the room in the dim wardrobe, waiting to be properly brushed and put away come morning. A single evening gown of the quality Evelyn wore tonight, made by a dressmaker whose small shop off Bond Street served perhaps 40 families in all of London, and turned away considerably more than that, represented an amount of money that would startle most people who never had cause to think about such things. The silk alone, imported, dyed to that particular deep wine colour through a process that took the dye house the better part of a week to get exactly right, cost more than many households spent on food across an entire month. The labour, the fitting, the boning, the trim, added considerably more again, and that was only a single gown among what Evelyn herself now considered a perfectly reasonable evening wardrobe, perhaps 15 or 20 such gowns in steady rotation, each one worn, retired for a season or two, occasionally remade with new trim to extend its fashionable life, and eventually passed down, given away, or simply set aside once its particular colour or cut had drifted too far from whatever the current fashion plates demanded. This was not extravagance exactly, not by the standards of Evelyn's own world, though she understood, in the distant abstract way that a person understands facts they have never had to feel the weight of, that the same sum of money could, in a different London entirely, have kept a working family fed and housed for the better part of a year. She did not dwell on this thought long tonight, nor did she dwell on it long most nights, not out of callousness exactly, but because the two Londons, hers and the other one, rarely intersected in any way that made the comparison feel immediate or real. She had encountered poverty the way most people of her class encountered it, at a careful distance, through a charitable committee she herself had joined the previous year, largely out of a sense of obligation, through a few coins pressed into a beggar's hand from a moving carriage window, through newspaper columns that described conditions in the East End with a kind of horrified fascination that never quite translated into anything closer than that. What she understood more intimately, because it touched her directly, was the way clothing itself functioned as a kind of constant silent conversation, one gown speaking to a room full of people before its wearer had said a single word. The cut told a story about how current, how fashionable, how attentive to the latest changes coming out of Paris a family chose to be. The fabric told a story about wealth, obviously, but also about taste, since a family with more money than judgment might choose something too elaborate, too heavy with trim, in a way that read, to the practiced eyes of women like Mrs. Ashworth, as slightly vulgar rather than impressive. The colour told a story about age and status, certain shades considered appropriate only for very young women just entering society, others reserved, by unspoken but universally understood convention, for married women, and a small specific palette of black, grey, mauve, and lavender reserved entirely for women in various stages of formal mourning, a system so precisely calibrated that a woman's exact place in her own family's recent losses could be read, at a glance, by anyone who understood the code. Full mourning giving way after a set period to half mourning eventually giving way to ordinary colour again, the whole sequence stretched out over months, or, for a widow, sometimes years. Evelyn had worn mourning herself twice in her life, once briefly for a grandmother she barely remembered, once for a longer, harder stretch when she was 16 and her elder brother's closest friend, a young man who had practically grown up alongside their own family, died suddenly of a fever that no doctor could quite explain. She remembered the particular strangeness of those months, the heavy black fabric, the way the household itself seemed to soften and hush around her, Social invitations declined by unspoken mutual understanding. The entire glittering machinery of the season simply paused, for her family at least, while the appropriate period of visible grief ran its course. It was a strange system, when she thought about it directly, this idea that grief itself had a wardrobe, a fabric, a fixed and socially agreed upon calendar, and yet there was something too that she had come to appreciate about it, a structure that gave shape to an otherwise shapeless kind of pain, a way of signaling to an entire watching society, without needing to explain anything to anyone directly, exactly how she was feeling, and exactly how much room she needed. Tonight's gown, by contrast, spoke an entirely different, considerably lighter language, the language of a young unmarried woman in good health, good spirits, and good standing, dressed exactly as current fashion and her own family's means suggested she should be dressed for an evening at the theatre and a late supper afterward. Nothing more complicated than that, and yet, in its own small way, still communicating everything a stranger glancing across a crowded restaurant might need to know about who she was and where, roughly, she belonged. She thinks briefly about the play itself, the comedy she watched without entirely watching, its plot resolved now into some hazy blur of mistaken identities, and a wedding scene she remembers more for the particular quality of laughter it produced around her than for any specific line of dialogue. Opera glasses had circulated through the boxes around her for the entire performance. Small brass instruments passed occasionally between family members, their stated purpose to bring the distant stage into clearer focus. Their actual, more frequent purpose, as it had been for as long as theatres had existed in this particular fashionable form, to bring other boxes into clearer focus instead, an entire audience quietly studying itself throughout a performance that most of them could have followed perfectly well with the naked eye. The whole evening, laid out now in her mind in this loose half-asleep sequence, had been built from dozens of these small performances layered one on top of another. The performance of arriving well, the performance of dining properly, the performance of watching and being watched through an evening of theatre, the performance most delicately of all of a first proper conversation with a young man whose attention she found, against every careful practiced composure she had spent years learning to maintain, genuinely difficult to stop thinking about. The theatre itself, the one Evelyn had sat inside for the better part of 3 hours earlier this evening, had been rebuilt only a decade or so ago after a fire, an event Evelyn remembered only vaguely from her own childhood, mostly through the newspaper accounts of the smoke visible from several streets away, and the considerable anxiety that had rippled through fashionable London for the several days it took to confirm that nobody had been seriously hurt. The new building that had risen in its place, grander in nearly every respect than its predecessor, represented exactly the kind of confident, forward-looking investment that London's theatre owners had been pouring into their establishments throughout Evelyn's own lifetime. Wider foyers, more elaborate decoration, improved sightlines from even the cheaper seats, and, importantly, considerably better safety measures than the building it replaced. Wider exits, more substantial fire curtains, a lesson learned, however painfully, from exactly the kind of disaster that had claimed the old structure. Evelyn had heard her father mention, on more than one occasion, that theatre fires had once been a genuine and serious danger throughout London, gaslighting itself, for all the warmth and glamour it brought to an evening exactly like tonight's, carrying its own considerable risk when concentrated in such quantity so close to painted scenery and heavy curtains and several hundred tightly packed patrons. The newer generation of theatres, this one included, had been built with that risk very much in mind, and the increasing adoption of electric lighting throughout these same buildings owed at least part of its appeal to precisely this safety consideration. Electric bulbs producing no open flame at all, a steadier, cooler light that reduced, though never entirely eliminated, the particular danger that had claimed the previous building. None of this crossed Evelyn's mind during the performance itself, absorbed as she had been in the play, in Mr. Hartley, in the whole elaborate social choreography of the evening, and it crosses her mind only now, in this loose associative drift towards sleep, a small, distant awareness of just how much careful engineering and hard-learnt caution sat quietly behind an evening that had felt, throughout, effortlessly glamorous and entirely safe. This too, she supposes, was simply one more example of the same broader pattern she had noticed earlier regarding the gaslit streets themselves. Comfort and safety so thoroughly, so carefully constructed around people exactly like her, that the construction itself became invisible, noticed if at all, only in brief, retrospective moments like this one. The restaurant they had dined in earlier tonight was, Evelyn reflects now, only one of perhaps half a dozen establishments that occupied roughly the same fashionable tier in London's current dining landscape, each with its own particular character, its own particular clientele, its own particular reputation among people who paid close attention to exactly such distinctions. The grand hotels along Piccadilly and the Strand offered dining rooms of comparable, sometimes even greater splendour, vast spaces built to impress not merely London society, but the considerable international clientele that passed through their doors, visiting dignitaries, wealthy travellers from the continent and from America, an entire cosmopolitan layer of guests that gave those particular dining rooms a slightly different, more worldly atmosphere than the restaurant Evelyn's family had chosen tonight, which catered rather more exclusively to established London society itself. Her family had dined at one of the grand hotels only a handful of times, on occasions that called for something grander still than their usual fashionable rotation, a significant family celebration 2 years earlier, a dinner in honour of a visiting relative from abroad the year before that. Evelyn remembered those evenings as slightly more overwhelming than tonight's. The sheer scale of the rooms, the greater diversity of languages overheard from nearby tables, a certain grandeur that, while impressive, had never felt quite as comfortably, familiarly hers as the smaller, more specifically fashionable restaurant she had visited tonight, one where she recognised, across any given evening, perhaps a third of the other diners by sight, if not always by name. There was comfort, she thought now, in precisely that familiarity, in belonging to a world small enough that its favourite restaurants and theatres functioned almost like extensions of one's own social circle rather than anonymous public spaces, every fashionable venue in London's West End populated, essentially, by the same several hundred families circulating through the same several dozen approved locations, season after season, year after year, a closed and comfortable ecosystem that Evelyn had never once had cause to feel confined by, since it had never once, in her entire experience, felt like anything other than exactly where she belonged. The bedroom Evelyn has slept in since she was a girl of 9 has changed only in small ways over the intervening 13 years. The furniture rearranged twice, the wallpaper replaced once, a writing desk added when she turned 16 and began, briefly and inconsistently, keeping a diary that she still maintains now, though considerably less faithfully than she once did. Entries arriving in irregular bursts rather than the disciplined daily habit her 16-year-old self had originally intended. The desk sits now in shadow near the window, its surface bare except for a small stack of unanswered correspondence and an inkwell that has not been refilled in perhaps 2 weeks, and Evelyn glances toward it briefly from the warmth of her bed, considering, for exactly as long as it takes to consider and dismiss the idea, whether tonight might be a night worth recording properly. The novel on that same bedside table, still creased at the same page it has held for 3 nights running, is one Frances had actually recommended first, a detail Evelyn finds faintly amusing now, since Frances rarely reads anything published within the last decade, and had seemed almost surprised herself to enjoy this particular story, a tale of a young woman navigating some complicated inheritance and an equally complicated engagement, the sort of plot that Evelyn suspects, without having yet reached the ending, will resolve itself just as neatly and just as predictably as tonight's comedy had, though she finds she does not mind that predictability in the slightest, tucked here in the safety of her own bed, some nights simply calling for exactly the kind of story whose ending you can already half guess and enjoy anyway. It will not be tonight. Whatever she eventually writes about this particular evening, the oysters, the rain, the small round table lit by candlelight, will have to wait for some clearer, more rested morning when she can find the right words for something that currently exists in her mind only as a loose collection of textures and sensations, rather than anything she could yet organize into proper sentences. This, too, is a familiar pattern, evenings that feel, in the moment, too significant to reduce to ordinary description, requiring instead a kind of settling period before she can even begin to explain them properly to herself, let alone to the pages of a diary that nobody else will ever read. The room holds its own particular collection of small accumulated objects, evidence of 27 years spent almost entirely within these same four walls. A shelf of books, some read many times, others barely started and permanently abandoned partway through. A small painted box that had belonged to a great-aunt, its lid depicting a scene of some foreign harbour Evelyn has never visited and likely never will. A single pressed flower, kept for reasons she can no longer entirely remember, flattened between the pages of a book she rarely opens anymore. None of it particularly valuable in the way the pearls now resting in their velvet box are valuable, and yet all of it, in its own quiet way, considerably more hers than the pearls have ever managed to feel, since the pearls belonged first to a grandmother she barely remembers, and will belong, eventually, to some daughter or niece not yet born, while these smaller, humbler objects have only ever belonged to exactly one person, and always will. The fire's last embers shift slightly in the grate, settling with a soft, barely audible collapse that Evelyn registers only as a change in the quality of light against the ceiling, rather than as any distinct sound, and the warmth of the bed continues its slow work against the last remaining tension in her shoulders, a tension she had not fully noticed carrying until this exact moment, when its gradual release becomes, suddenly, the most obvious sensation in the entire room. It occurs to her, lying here now turning the evening over in her mind, how differently a night exactly like this one might have unfolded 5 or 6 years earlier, when she was newer to all of this, quicker to blush, considerably less certain of exactly which fork belonged to which course, or how long a glance could safely linger before it became something worth remarking on. She has watched 2 full crops of younger debutantes arrive and marry and settle into their own households since her own first season, has stood as godmother to a friend's daughter already, and there is a version of tonight's careful uncertainty that would have felt at 19 or 20 almost unbearably urgent in a way it simply does not feel now. She has run her father's household competently and independently for 3 years, has grown entirely comfortable managing her own calendar, her own correspondence, her own small corner of a large and demanding house, and she understands, in a way her younger self could not have, that a single evening, however promising, rarely settles anything by itself. There is a version of her own life, she supposes, in which she never marries at all, continues on precisely as she is now for another decade or 2, moving confidently through exactly this same fashionable world on her own terms, before eventually becoming something rather like Mrs. Ashworth herself, established, independent, answerable to no one. She does not find the thought nearly as frightening as she once might have. There is a great deal to be said, she has come to understand, for a life built entirely on one's own terms, whatever shape it eventually takes. For now, though, none of that certainty has settled itself either way, and Evelyn found herself glad of it, glad that tonight still felt exactly as immediate and as uncertain and as quietly thrilling as it did, glad that several years of practiced composure had not managed to talk her out of caring quite this much about a single held glance across a crowded theatre. She thinks briefly of the theatre's painted ceiling, the muses and clouds she has looked at so many times without ever quite absorbing, and finds herself wondering, in the particular idle way thoughts wander at this hour, who had painted it, and when, and whether that artist had any idea, brush in hand decades earlier, that his work would end up positioned directly above so many thousands of evenings exactly like this one, so many small, private dramas of courtship and hope playing out beneath his clouds, while almost nobody in the audience ever thought to look up long enough to properly see what he had made. Tomorrow, Evelyn knows, will begin its own version of today, though gentler, since mornings after a late evening like this one were, by long-standing household custom, allowed to begin later than usual. She will wake, eventually, to a maid drawing back the curtains and a cup of tea left steaming on the very same bedside table where the unread novel still waits, and the day that follows will move at an entirely different pace than the night that preceded it, calling hours in the early afternoon, correspondence to answer, perhaps a walk in the park if the weather holds, all of it considerably quieter than tonight's glittering circuit of restaurant and theatre and supper room, and yet, in its own way, no less carefully governed by rules she has spent her whole life learning to read, without needing to think about them consciously. There will very likely be a note from Mrs. Ashworth, tucked in among the ordinary morning correspondence, some brief warm mention of what a pleasant evening it had been, perhaps a small aside about Mr. Hartley that would say considerably more than its handful of casual words technically contained. There will be her father's quiet, faintly amused glance across the breakfast table, the particular look he gives her whenever he suspects there is more to a story than she is letting on, a look Evelyn has grown quite skilled at meeting with an expression of perfect, untroubled blankness. And there will be, running beneath all of it, the same slow, patient machinery that governs every courtship in her world, days and weeks stretching out ahead in which absolutely nothing might happen, or in which everything might begin to happen, and no reliable way at all to know in advance which of those two futures she is currently standing at the edge of. She has watched this exact uncertainty play out around her for 2 full seasons now, watched friends receive calls that led, eventually, to engagements announced in the papers, watched other friends receive calls that simply tapered off after a few pleasant weeks into nothing more than polite acquaintance, the gentleman's attention drifting, for reasons rarely explained and rarely asked about directly, towards some other young woman entirely. There was no guaranteed sequence, no fixed number of visits that reliably led anywhere in particular, only the same patient, careful accumulation of small gestures, small conversations, small permitted proximities, building slowly toward whatever they were eventually going to build toward, or quietly, without any dramatic ending at all, not building toward anything. It occurs to Evelyn, in the loose, unguarded way thoughts occur at the very edge of sleep, that she does not actually mind the uncertainty tonight, not the way she sometimes has after other evenings, other conversations that led nowhere. There is something almost pleasant in simply not knowing yet, in holding tonight's small hopeful details, the nod, the bow, the particular attentiveness in his questions about the play, without needing to resolve them into any firm conclusion at all. Whatever comes of it will come of it in its own time, through its own slow sequence of calling cards and chaperoned visits and careful watched conversations, and there is nothing at all she can do tonight, lying warm and heavy-eyed in this dark, quiet room, to hurry any of it along. For tonight, the evening has already given her everything it was going to give her. A good dinner, an interesting play, or interesting enough, a rain shower survived in perfect dry comfort, a name finally properly attached to a face she had been carrying around, half remembered, for several weeks. And now, at the end of all of it, a warm bed, a quiet house, and the particular, complete relief of an entire long evening's careful performance finally, fully set down. There is one more memory that surfaces now, unbidden, in these last drifting minutes before sleep finally takes her, one Evelyn had not thought of once during the evening itself, but that arrives now, as odd, half-connected memories sometimes do, at exactly this hour. She thinks of her friend Charlotte, a young woman she came out alongside 2 seasons earlier, who had, during her own first season, made the mistake, if mistake was even the right word for something so small, of walking twice around a garden at a country house party with a young man she had only just met, out of sight of the rest of the party for perhaps 6 or 7 minutes in total. Nothing had happened. Charlotte herself had insisted, then and afterward, that nothing had happened, that they had discussed nothing more scandalous than a shared enthusiasm for a particular composer, and Evelyn, who trusted Charlotte completely, believed her without reservation. But someone had noticed the 2 of them disappear around the hedge, and had mentioned it to someone else, in the light, careless way such things get mentioned, and by the following week, a story considerably more interesting than the actual 6 minutes in the garden had begun circulating through their part of London, growing a little with each retelling the way stories do, until Charlotte found herself, for the better part of a month, the subject of exactly the kind of speculative gossip that no young woman in her position wanted attached to her name. Nothing permanent came of it, in the end. Charlotte's family was well established enough, her own conduct in every other respect impeccable enough, that the story eventually faded, replaced in the collective attention of London society by some newer, fresher piece of gossip involving somebody else entirely. Charlotte herself was married now, quite happily as far as Evelyn could tell, to a perfectly respectable man, who had, as it happened, nothing to do with the garden or the composer or any of it. But Evelyn remembered vividly the particular strained quality in Charlotte's face during those weeks, the effort it took to walk into a drawing room full of people who she suspected, correctly, had been discussing her only moments before her arrival. It was a small story, in the end, small and, in the strictest sense, almost entirely without consequence, and yet Evelyn had carried it with her ever since, tucked somewhere in the back of her mind, a quiet, permanent reminder of exactly how little separated a perfectly innocent 6 minutes from a month of uncomfortable whispers, how thin the margin actually was between an evening like tonight's, carefully, correctly managed from its opening bow to its final farewell, and an evening that could, through nothing more than an unlucky glance from the wrong person at the wrong moment, become something else entirely. This was, she supposed, part of why the whole elaborate system existed in the first place. The introductions, the chaperones, the careful geometry of who stood how close to whom and for how long, not because anyone genuinely believed that 6 minutes in a garden or a slightly extended conversation at a supper table was likely to lead to actual impropriety, but because reputation, once questioned, proved remarkably difficult to fully repair, regardless of how unfair or how thoroughly unearned the original question had been, and an entire elaborate architecture of rules had grown up, over generations, specifically to prevent that particular kind of damage before it could ever begin. Evelyn had been careful tonight, properly, comfortably careful, in the way that came almost automatically now after 2 full seasons of practice. Every conversation with Mr. Hartley had taken place in full view of at least one, and usually several other people. Every glance exchanged across a room had been brief enough to remain entirely deniable, the kind of small courtesy that could never be spun into gossip by even the most determined storyteller. She had enjoyed every minute of it anyway, had felt something genuinely alive and interesting move through an evening that could, on paper, be described as nothing more than a series of perfectly ordinary social obligations correctly performed. That, she thinks now, drifting further towards sleep with each passing minute, was perhaps the real skill Mrs. Ashworth and every woman like her had spent decades quietly perfecting, not the avoidance of feeling, but the careful, practiced art of allowing real feeling to exist and even to flourish entirely within the visible, sanctioned boundaries of a system built to watch it happen. Charlotte's mistake, if it could even be called that, had been a matter of geography, not of the heart, 6 minutes spent somewhere she could not be seen, rather than somewhere she could. Evelyn had made no such mistake tonight. Every moment of whatever had passed between herself and Mr. Hartley had happened in full, well-lit view of an entire watching room, and that, more than anything else about the evening, was precisely what made it safe enough to feel as good as it currently, quietly, still did. There is one last small thing worth naming before the night fully closes over her, a detail so small it would be easy to miss entirely. Somewhere between the theatre and the supper room, in the ordinary press of a departing crowd, Mr. Hartley had briefly steadied her elbow as she stepped down from the carriage a second time that evening, a touch that lasted perhaps 2 seconds, entirely proper, entirely unremarkable to anyone watching, and yet the only moment all night in which his hand had actually touched any part of her at all. She had not thought of it again until just now, drifting towards sleep, and she finds, turning it over one final time, that it is this small, fleeting detail, rather than anything said in conversation, that she will probably remember longest. She thinks, too, of the particular sound the restaurant door made behind them on the way out, a heavy, well-oiled click that seemed to seal the whole glittering evening shut behind it the moment they stepped back onto the pavement, and of how strange it always felt, that specific transition, moving in the space of a single doorway from a room built entirely around being seen to a street, where for just a few seconds before the carriage door opened, nobody was looking at her at all. She rather liked those few seconds, she realizes now, turning the thought over one final time in the growing warmth of her own bed. Small pockets of anonymity tucked in between all the evening's careful visibility, breaths taken in doorways and stairwells, and the backs of carriages where nothing at all was expected of her except to simply exist for a moment before the next room, the next introduction, the next careful performance began again. Somewhere across the sleeping city, Church bells that Evelyn will never consciously hear mark the passing hours with the same patient regularity they have kept for centuries. London itself continuing its enormous, uneven rhythm of rest and labour entirely independent of whether any single one of its residents happens to be awake to notice. A baker somewhere begins the earliest stages of the following morning's bread, hours before Evelyn's own household will stir. A newspaper press somewhere else runs through its final overnight edition, ink and paper and the steady clatter of machinery filling a warehouse that never, throughout the entire year, falls fully silent. None of it reaches this quiet Mayfair bedroom, and none of it needs to. The evening that began with a hook fastened at the back of a wine-coloured gown has closed, gently and completely, into exactly the kind of untroubled sleep that a long, full night earns for the person lucky enough to have lived it well. And London, vast and restless and entirely unconcerned with any single sleeping household within it, simply continues on, as it always does, toward whatever the next morning happens to bring. The very last stretch of waking thought arrives now in fragments too loose and too soft to properly call thoughts at all, more a slow drift of half-formed impressions passing behind closed eyes, the particular weight of the counterpane settling more fully now across her legs, the last faint warmth still rising from the embers in the grate, a distant, barely audible sound that might be a carriage 2 streets over, or might simply be the house itself settling, as old houses do, into the deeper stillness of the night's later hours. She thinks, once more and without any particular urgency, of the oysters, cold and briny and strange, and then, without any clear transition, of the rain against the theatre awning, and then of nothing at all for a long moment. The specific blankness that arrives just before sleep fully claims a tired mind, and then, briefly, of a small round table lit by candlelight, and a name spoken for the first time by a woman whose entire purpose that evening had seemed to be exactly this, the quiet, decisive work of connecting 2 people who might otherwise have continued circling each other indefinitely, without ever quite touching. Her breathing has grown slow, and even now, the particular rhythm of someone genuinely, finally asleep, rather than merely resting, and the small specific tension that had lived somewhere behind her eyes for most of the evening, the careful, constant awareness of being watched, of needing to hold herself just so, of managing every word and every glance with the practiced precision that an evening like tonight's demanded, has dissolved completely, leaving behind only the simple, unguarded stillness of a young woman finally, thoroughly at rest. The lamp on the bedside table, its flame turned low hours ago, continues its small, steady burning, casting the faintest possible light across a room that has by now settled fully into its nightly stillness. The wine-coloured gown hanging quiet and dark in the wardrobe, the pearls resting in their velvet box, the unread novel still creased at the same page it has held for 3 nights running, waiting, like so much else in this room, for a morning that has not yet arrived. Outside, far beyond the heavy curtains, the last hansom cabs of the night make their final, unhurried journeys home, carrying the very last stragglers from whatever suppers and gatherings kept London's fashionable circle out later even than Evelyn's own evening ran. A policeman completes another slow, patient circuit of an empty street, checking, out of long habit, a row of shop doors that have not changed since his last pass an hour earlier. The gas lamps burn on, steady and patient, holding back the darkness over pavements that, for these deepest hours of the night, almost nobody walks at all. None of it reaches this quiet room, this warm bed, this one young woman finally, completely asleep after an entire evening spent beautifully dressed and constantly, carefully observed. The house around her has settled fully into its own nightly stillness, waiting, as it waits every single night, for whatever the following morning will eventually bring. There will be other evenings this season, plenty of them, dinners and balls and theatre nights stretching ahead through the coming weeks and months, each one carrying its own small measure of the same careful hope that tonight had carried, and Evelyn understands, even in this drowsy, half-asleep state, that most of those evenings will resolve into nothing more memorable than pleasant, ordinary company, forgotten within days, indistinguishable from a dozen others exactly like them. That is simply how a season worked, an accumulation of evenings, most of them unremarkable, a small handful of them, for reasons not always obvious in the moment, becoming the ones a person actually remembers years later when asked to recall how something important in her life first began. Whether tonight belongs to that small, memorable handful she cannot yet know, and does not, in this final drifting stretch before sleep, feel any particular urgency to know. It has been, regardless of what comes after it, a full and generous evening, oysters and rain and candlelight, and a name spoken for the first time by a woman who had clearly enjoyed making exactly that small introduction happen, and there is enough in that alone, Evelyn thinks, enough warmth and enough small quiet pleasure to carry her comfortably into sleep without needing anything further resolved before morning. The house holds its stillness around her. The city holds its own quieter stillness beyond the curtains, and somewhere in the gentle, unhurried space between one and the other, in a warm bed at the end of a long and carefully lived evening, Evelyn finally, completely lets go. There is something quietly circular, Evelyn thinks, in an evening that began with Sarah's careful hands at the back of her gown, and ends now with those same hands, hours later, having undone every hook, every pin, every careful arrangement, returning her, piece by piece, to something closer to the girl she had been before any of tonight's elaborate performance began. The evening gown had transformed her, briefly, into a particular version of herself, composed, watched, carefully presented, and the nightdress has transformed her back again into something plainer and more private, and she finds herself grateful, lying here now in the last comfortable minutes before sleep, for a household rhythm patient enough to allow both versions their proper place, the public evening and the private night, each one following the other in a sequence so familiar it has become, over 27 years, almost like breathing. Tomorrow the whole sequence will begin again in its gentler daytime form, and the evening after that, should another invitation arrive, it will build once more toward exactly this same elaborate architecture of dress and dinner and careful conversation, and Evelyn, drifting now fully towards sleep, finds that she does not mind the repetition at all, finds instead a particular comfort in it, the reliable, returning shape of a life that, whatever its careful restrictions, whatever its elaborate unspoken rules, has never once, in her entire experience, failed to bring her safely home again at the end of even its longest, most eventful nights. The last coherent thought dissolves gently into something softer, wordless, and Evelyn sleeps. And that in the end is where the night finally settles, not in any grand resolution, not in any answer about Mr. Hartley or what next season might bring, but simply here, in this warm, quiet room, in a house that has held 4 generations of exactly these same evenings, exactly this same slow, careful return from the glittering, watched world outside to the private, unwatched world within. The gaslights along her street burn on without her, the last carriages finish their rounds without her, and Evelyn, finally and completely, sleeps. The house settles once more around her, the particular small creak of old timber cooling after the day's warmth, a sound so familiar across 27 years that it barely registers any more as anything worth noticing at all. Somewhere below, a clock she cannot quite place finishes its quiet count of the hour and falls silent again, and here, at the very end of it, warm and heavy-limbed and finally still, Evelyn simply rests. Beyond the closed curtains, London remains faintly audible, if only barely, a distant, occasional rumble of wheels on wet stone somewhere several streets away, a sound so soft now that it barely registers as sound at all, more a suggestion of the city's continued existence than anything Evelyn's drifting attention actually processes. Her jewellery has been put away, pearls and earrings and a slim gold bracelet resting now in their small velvet-lined box on the dressing table, waiting for whatever evening eventually calls them out again. Her gown is no longer on her body, hanging instead in the dark of the wardrobe across the room, wine-coloured silk gone quiet and still until Sarah's careful morning attention brings it properly back to order. Her gloves rest folded nearby, and the fire in the small grate has burned down lower still, embers now more than flame, holding just enough warmth to see the room safely through until morning. The carriage that carried her through the glowing, crowded heart of the West End tonight, has long since returned to the mews behind the house, the horses unharnessed, brushed down, and settled for whatever remains of the night, the coachman himself finally, gratefully, off to his own bed. The restaurant where she dined is nearly dark now, its chandeliers extinguished one by one as the last staff finished their closing work, the mirrors that doubled the whole glittering room, reflecting nothing at all but empty tables and folded linen, until tomorrow evening brings a fresh crowd to fill them again. The theatre stands dark and silent, its stage empty, its boxes cleared, waiting through the small hours for a performance that will not resume until tomorrow night. Even the small candlelit supper room has finished its service by now, its last champagne bottle emptied, its last table cleared, its brief nightly window of fashionable energy closed until the next evening's crowd arrives to open it again. Whatever may eventually come of the young man she encountered twice tonight, once in a theatre foyer and once across a small round table lit by candlelight, belongs now to another day entirely, a day governed by its own slow, careful sequence of calling cards, left on silver trays, of chaperoned afternoon visits, of letters weighed and considered before ever being sent, of family conversations conducted quietly over breakfast tables, not unlike her own. Tonight has already given whatever it was going to give. The rest, if there is a rest, will unfold in its own unhurried time. For tonight, nothing more is required of her. The room is warm. The curtains are closed against a city that continues, somewhere far beyond them, its own quiet, unhurried business through the last hours before dawn. The house around her has settled fully into sleep, her parents in their own rooms down the hall, Sarah in her own narrow bed one floor above, the whole tall, quiet Mayfair townhouse holding its breath, as it does every single night, until morning brings it gently back to life again. One complete night in Victorian London has come, at last, to its end. Somewhere beyond the window, the last gas lamps continue their patient burning, keeping their steady watch over empty pavements until the lamplighter makes his rounds again at dawn. Evelyn does not hear them. She is already asleep.